Dawn broke over the rugged landscape surrounding Cody, Wyoming, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. John Miller stirred in his bed, his eyes fluttering open as the first rays of sunlight peeked through the curtains of his modest cabin. At 60 years old, retirement had brought him to this serene corner of the world, far from the bustle of city life he'd known for decades. John sat up, stretching his arms above his head as he yawned. The familiar creak of his joints reminded him of his age, but it did little to dampen his spirits. Every morning here felt like a gift, a chance to embrace the natural beauty that surrounded him. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet finding the warm, worn planks of the wooden floor. As he stood, a soft whine caught his attention. John smiled, looking down at Max, his loyal golden retriever, who was already awake and eager for their daily ritual. "Good morning, boy," John said, his voice still rough with sleep. He reached down to ruffle the dog's ears. "Ready for our walk?" Max's tail wagged furiously in response, his whole body quivering with excitement. John chuckled, the sound warming the quiet cabin. All right. Let me get dressed first." John moved through his morning routine with practiced ease. He splashed, cold water on his face, the shock helping to chase away the last vestiges of sleep. As he looked in the mirror, he took in the familiar sight of his weathered face, lined with the stories of a life well lived. His grey hair was thinning, but his blue eyes still sparkled with vitality. He dressed simply in worn jeans, a flannel shirt, and sturdy hiking boots. The cabin was cool, so he grabbed a light jacket from the hook by the door. Max circled his feet impatiently as John filled a water bottle and stuffed it into his backpack along with a few granola bars. "Patience, Max," John admonished gently. "We've got all morning." Finally ready, John opened the cabin door and a rush of crisp mountain air filled his lungs. He inhaled deeply, savoring the scent of pine and earth. The sun had risen higher now, its warmth beginning to chase away the night's chill. John stepped onto the small porch, surveying the landscape before him. The cabin sat on the edge of a clearing surrounded by dense forest. In the distance, snow-capped peaks stretched towards the sky, their majesty never failing to take his breath away. "Beautiful. Morning, isn't it, Max?" John mused, more to himself than to the dog. Max, already at the bottom of the porch steps, barked in what John chose to interpret as agreement. As they set off towards the tree line, John felt the familiar sense of peace wash over him. This daily walk was more than just exercise. It was a communion with nature, a chance to feel truly alive. The forest welcomed them with a symphony of sounds. Birds called to one another from the treetops, while the wind whispered through the leaves. John's boots crunched softly on the pine needle-covered path, a rhythmic counterpoint to Max's excited panting. "You know, Max," John said as they walked, "I never thought I'd end up here." He often spoke to the dog on these walks, finding comfort in giving voice to his thoughts. All those years in the city, dreaming of a place like this, and now here we are. Max looked up at him, tongue lolling out in a doggy grin, before darting off to investigate an interesting smell. John chuckled. "Yeah, I know, you're just happy to be outside." They continued deeper into the woods, the familiar path winding its way through towering pines and aspens. John kept a leisurely pace, in no hurry to end their morning exploration. He paused occasionally to admire a particularly beautiful view, or to watch a squirrel scamper up a tree trunk. As they rounded a bend in the trail, John spotted a patch of wildflowers blooming in a small clearing. The vivid colors stood out against the green backdrop of the forest. "Look at that, Max," John called out. "Aren't they something?" He stepped off the path, moving closer to examine the delicate petals. Max, ever curious, bounded over to join him, nose twitching as he investigated the new scents. John knelt down, ignoring the protest in his knees, to get a better look at the flowers. He gently touched a petal, marveling at its softness. "You know, your mom would have loved these," John said softly, a hint of melancholy in his voice. She always did have a way with flowers. The memory of his late wife, Sarah, brought a bittersweet smile to his face. It had been her idea to retire to Wyoming, to find a place where they could truly connect with nature. Though she hadn't lived to see their dream realized, John felt her presence in moments like these. A sudden rustle in the underbrush snapped John out of his reverie. He stood quickly, scanning the area. Max's ears perked up, his body tensing slightly. "What is it, boy?" John asked, his voice low. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then a deer stepped cautiously into view, its large eyes fixed on John and Max. John let out a relieved chuckle. "It's all right, Max," he said, patting the dog's head. "Just a deer." The deer, apparently deciding they posed no threat, bent its head to graze on the lush grass. John watched in silent wonder, grateful for this intimate glimpse of wildlife. After a few minutes, the deer melted back into the forest as quietly as it had appeared. John took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of connection to the world around him. "Come on, Max," he said, turning back to the trail. "Let's head home. I think we've earned ourselves some breakfast." As they made their way back towards the cabin, John's mind wandered to the day ahead. Maybe he'd do some reading on the porch or work on that birdhouse he'd been meaning to build. The possibilities stretched out before him, unhurried and full of promise. The sun had climbed higher. In the sky by the time they emerged from the tree line, the cabin a welcome sight ahead. John paused at the edge of the clearing, taking one last look at the majestic landscape around him. "You know what, Max?" he said, a contented smile spreading across his face. "I think we've found our little piece of heaven right here," Max barked in response, tail wagging as if in agreement. Together, man and dog walked the final stretch to the cabin, ready to greet whatever the rest of the day might bring. As John reached for the cabin door, he felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. This quiet life, surrounded by nature's beauty, was everything he'd ever dreamed of. He couldn't wait to see what tomorrow's walk would bring. As John and Max ventured deeper into the woods, the familiar trail began to wind through denser undergrowth. The morning light filtered through the canopy, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. John breathed deeply, savoring the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. "Nothing like a morning in the woods, eh, Max?" John said, glancing down at his faithful companion. Max's tail wagged in response, his nose twitching as he caught the myriad scents of the forest. They had been walking for about an hour, following a path that John knew well. It was a route they took often, one that led to a small clearing with a breathtaking view of the distant mountains. John looked forward to reaching it, planning to sit for a while and enjoy a granola bar from his backpack. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Max suddenly stopped, his ears perking up. John paused, noticing the change in his dog's demeanor. "What is it, boy?" John asked, his voice low. Max let out a low whine, his body tensing. John felt a prickle of unease run down his spine. In all their walks, he'd never seen Max act quite like this. Then he heard it, a rustling sound coming from the dense underbrush to their right. It was too loud to be a small animal, too deliberate to be the wind. John's heart began to race as he realized what it might be. "Easy, Max," he whispered, reaching down to place a reassuring hand on the dog's head. "Let's just back away slowly." But before they could move, the underbrush parted, and John found himself face to face with his worst fear, a massive grizzly bear. Time seemed to stand still as John locked eyes with the creature. The bear was enormous, its brown fur tinged with silver, muscles rippling beneath its thick coat. It stood on all fours, its head lowered, dark eyes fixed intently on John and Max. John's mind raced, recalling everything he'd ever learned about bear encounters. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Speak calmly. But in that moment, faced with the reality of a grizzly barely 30 feet away, all that knowledge seemed to evaporate. "Hey there, big fella," John managed to croak out, his voice trembling. "We don't want any trouble, we're just passing through," the bear huffed, a deep rumbling sound that John felt in his chest. It took a step forward, and John instinctively took a step back, his hand still on Max's head. "Stay calm, Max," John murmured, as much to himself as to the dog. "We're going to be okay." But Max, driven by instinct and a desire to protect his master, let out a sharp bark. The sudden noise seemed to startle the bear, and in that moment everything changed. The grizzly reared up on its hind legs, towering over them at nearly 9 feet tall. It let out a deafening roar that shook John to his core. In that instant, he knew they were in grave danger. "Run, Max!" John yelled, turning on his heel and sprinting back down the trail. He could hear Max barking furiously behind him, and the thunderous sound of the bear crashing through the underbrush in pursuit. Adrenaline surged through John's body as he ran. Faster than he had in years, branches whipping at his face and arms. "Keep running, Max," John gasped out, risking a glance over his shoulder. His heart nearly stopped when he saw how close the bear was, its massive form eating up the distance between them with terrifying speed. John's mind raced, searching for a way out. He knew he couldn't outrun the bear. No human could. He needed a plan, and fast. Ahead he spotted a large tree with low-hanging branches. It was their only chance. "This way, Max." John veered off the trail, making a beeline for the tree. He could hear the bear's heavy breathing getting closer, feel the ground shaking with each of its strides. As he reached the tree, John leaped for the lowest branch, his fingers grasping desperately at the rough bark. For a terrifying moment, he thought he wouldn't make it. Then, with a surge of strength born of pure fear, he pulled himself up. "Max, go! Run!" John yelled, his voice hoarse with panic as he scrambled higher into the tree. Max, loyal to a fault, circled the base of the tree, barking defiantly at the approaching bear. John's heart clenched with fear for his beloved pet. "No, Max. Get out. Go here." The bear reached the tree, rising up on its hind legs again. Its massive paws swiped at the air, barely missing John's dangling feet as he pulled them up higher. Then, in a moment that would haunt John's nightmares for years to come, Max lunged at the bear, sinking his teeth into its hind leg. The bear roared in pain and fury, whirling around to face this new threat. John watched in horror as the massive creature swatted at Max, sending the dog flying into the underbrush with a yelp of pain. "Max!" John cried out, his voice breaking. He wanted desperately to go to his dog, but he knew that coming down from the tree would mean certain death. The bear, momentarily distracted by Max, turned its attention back to John. It circled the base of the tree, occasionally rising up to swipe at him. John clung to the branches, his arms trembling with the effort of holding on. Time seemed to lose all meaning as John remained trapped in the tree, the bear circling below. He spoke softly, constantly, hoping his voice might eventually drive the animal away. "Come on, big guy, you don't want me. I'm all skin and bones. Why don't you go find some nice berries instead?" But the bear showed no signs of leaving. It paced around the tree, occasionally standing up to test the lower branches. John watched it warily, his mind racing with possible outcomes. None of them good. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, John's fear began to mingle with exhaustion and thirst. His arms ached from holding onto the branches, and his mouth felt dry as sandpaper. He thought of the water bottle in his backpack, now lying uselessly on the ground where he'd dropped it during the chase. "What I wouldn't give for a drink right now," John muttered to himself. Or better yet, a helicopter with a team of bear wranglers. He chuckled weakly at his own joke, the sound edged with hysteria. The bear looked up at the noise, its dark eyes meeting John's. In that moment, John saw not malice, but a wild, primal hunger that chilled him to the bone. "You're just doing what comes naturally, aren't you?" John said softly. "This is your home. I'm the intruder here." As if in response, the bear huffed and sat down at the base of the tree, its eyes never leaving John. It seemed prepared to wait him out. John closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the rough bark of the tree. He thought of Sarah, wondering what she would say if she could see him now. Probably something about how he should have been more careful, followed by a fierce hug and a whispered, "I'm glad you're safe." "I might need a bit of help to make that last part true, honey," John whispered to the memory of his wife. As the standoff continued, John's thoughts turned to Max. He strained his ears, hoping to hear a bark or a whine, any sign that his loyal friend was okay. But the forest remained eerily quiet, save for the occasional snuffle from the bear below. "Please be okay, Max," John murmured. "I promise, if we get out of this, it's premium dog food and endless belly rubs for the rest of your life." The sun had passed its zenith and was beginning its slow descent when John noticed a change in the bear's behavior. It seemed more restless, frequently looking off into the distance and sniffing the air. Hope flickered in John's chest. Maybe, just maybe, the bear was losing interest. Sure enough, after what felt like an eternity, the grizzly lumbered to its feet. It cast one last look up at John, let out a low growl, then turned and ambled off into the underbrush. John hardly dared to breathe, watching the spot where the bear had disappeared. He counted to 100, then 200, listening intently for any sign of the bear's return. Finally, convinced that the danger had passed, John began to slowly, painfully make his way down the tree. His muscles screamed in protest as he climbed down, stiff from hours of inactivity. As his feet touched the ground, John let out a shaky breath. He was alive. He had survived. But the ordeal wasn't over yet. Somewhere out in these woods, Max was waiting for him, and John was determined to find his faithful friend, no matter what. It took John's feet had barely touched the ground when the reality of his situation hit him full force. His body ached from hours of clinging to the tree, and his throat was parched with thirst. But those discomforts paled in comparison to the worry gnawing at his gut. Max was still out there, possibly injured, or worse. "Max!" John called out, his voice hoarse. "Max, where are you, boy?" The forest remained eerily silent. John strained his ears for any sound, a whimper, a bark, anything that might lead him to his loyal companion. But all he could hear was the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze and the occasional call of a distant bird. John took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He needed to think clearly. Max had last been seen when the bear swatted him into the underbrush. That had been to the east of the tree, if John's muddled sense of direction was correct. "Okay, John," he muttered to himself. "One step at a time, find Max, then worry about getting home." He took a tentative step in the direction he thought Max had disappeared. His legs felt weak and unsteady, and he had to lean against a nearby tree for support. It was then that he noticed the scratches on his arms and face, souvenirs from his frantic run through the forest. The adrenaline that had numbed him earlier was wearing off, leaving him acutely aware of every scrape and bruise. "Max!" he called again, louder this time. "Come on, boy, where are you?" John pushed through the underbrush, his eyes scanning the forest floor for any sign of his dog. Every shadow made him flinch, his nerves still on edge from the bear encounter. He knew the grizzly could still be nearby, and the thought made his skin crawl. As he searched, John's mind raced with possibilities. What if Max was seriously hurt? What if the bear had... No, he couldn't think like that. Max was tough. He had to be okay. "I should have brought the bear spray," John berated himself. Should have been more prepared. Stupid. He had always been cautious on their walks, but he'd grown complacent over time. The forest had felt so safe, so familiar. Now it seemed alien and threatening, full of hidden dangers. John's foot caught on a root and he stumbled, barely catching himself before he fell. The near miss sent a jolt of pain through his already aching body, and he couldn't hold back a groan. "Getting old, John," he muttered. "Too old for this kind of adventure." But he pressed on, driven by the need to find Max. The dog was more than just a pet. He was John's constant companion, his link to Sarah. The thought of losing him was unbearable. As John pushed through a particularly dense patch of undergrowth, he heard something that made his heart leap. A faint whimper. "Max?" he called out, hope surging through him. "Max, is that you?" Another whimper, slightly louder this time. John moved towards the sound, his fatigue forgotten. He rounded a large boulder, and there, lying in a small clearing, was Max. "Oh, thank God," John breathed, rushing to his dog's side. "Max, I'm here, boy, I'm here." Max lifted his head weakly, his tail giving a feeble wag. John knelt beside him, his hands gently running over the dog's body, checking for injuries. Max winced as John touched his left hind leg. "Easy, boy," John soothed. "Let me take a look." The leg was swollen, and John could see a nasty gash along Max's flank. The bear's claws had left their mark, but Max was alive, and that was what mattered most. "You're gonna be okay, Max," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're gonna get you home and patched up. You hear me? You're gonna be just fine." Max whined softly, nuzzling John's hand. The simple gesture of trust and affection nearly undid John. He blinked back tears, overwhelmed by relief and love for his faithful friend. "You saved my life, you know that," John said, gently stroking Max's head. "You distracted that bear, gave me time to get up that tree. You're a hero, Max, a real hero." But their ordeal wasn't over yet. They were still deep in the woods, miles from home, with a wounded dog and the constant threat of the bear's return. John knew he needed to get them both to safety, and fast. "All right, Max," John said, steeling himself. "We've got to move. Think you can stand?" He helped Max to his feet, supporting the dog's weight. Max whimpered as he put pressure on his injured leg, but he remained standing. John felt a surge of pride at his dog's resilience. "That's my boy," he encouraged. "We'll take it slow, okay? One step at a time." John looked around, trying to get his bearings. In the chaos of the bear chase and the long hours in the tree, he'd lost all sense of direction. The forest that had once been so familiar now seemed like an endless maze of trees and underbrush. "Okay, think," John muttered to himself. "The sun was rising on our right when we started out this morning, so if it's afternoon now..." He squinted, up at the sky visible in patches through the canopy. After a moment he made his decision. "This way, Max," he said, pointing. "Home is this way, I hope." They set off at a painfully slow pace. John supported Max as much as he could, but the going was tough. Every step was a challenge, with uneven ground and obstacles hidden beneath the leaf litter. John's own exhaustion and injuries didn't help matters. As they trudged on, John kept up a steady stream of encouragement, as much for himself as for Max. "You're doing great, boy. Just a little further. We're almost there. Just keep moving." But as the minutes stretched into hours, John's optimism began to waver. The forest seemed endless, and every tree looked the same. Were they even going in the right direction? What if they were just getting more lost? The thought of spending a night in the forest, injured and unprotected, sent a chill down John's spine. He tried to push the fear aside, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other. "We're going to make it, Max," he said, his voice strained. "We have to." As the light began to fade, filtering through the trees in long, golden beams, John's desperation grew. They needed to find their way home soon, or they'd be forced to spend the night in the open. Just when John was about to give in to despair, he heard something that made his heart soar, the distant sound of running water. "Do you hear that, Max?" he said excitedly. "That's Miller's Creek. We're close to home." With renewed energy, John quickened their pace, following the sound of the creek. As they pushed through a final stand of trees, John let out a cry of joy. There in the distance, he could see the roof of his cabin. "We made it, Max," John exclaimed, tears of relief streaming down his face. "We're home." The last 100 yards were the hardest, John's legs trembling with exhaustion. But the sight of the cabin spurred him on. Finally, blessedly, they reached the porch. John fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the door. As they stumbled inside, the familiar smells and sights of home washed over them. They were safe. Gently, John helped Max onto his bed in the corner of the living room. The dog sank into it with a grateful whine. "Rest now, boy," John said softly, patting Max's head. "You've earned it. I'm going to call the vet, get you looked at." As John reached for the phone, the events of the day caught up with him. His legs gave out and he sank to the floor, his back against the wall. He was alive. Max was alive. They had survived. But as the adrenaline faded and the reality of their close call set in, John began to shake. Sobs racked his body as the fear and stress he'd been holding back finally broke free. In that moment, as the sun set on the most terrifying day of his life, John Miller wept. For the danger they'd faced, for the pain they'd endured, and for the precious gift of survival they'd been granted. As John's sobs subsided, he wiped his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. The reality of their situation settled in, and he knew he needed to act quickly. Max's injuries required immediate attention. "Okay, boy," John said, his voice still shaky. "Let's get you taken care of." He pushed himself up from the floor, wincing at the protest from his aching muscles. Limping to the bathroom, John retrieved the first aid kit he kept under the sink. It wasn't much, but it would have to do until he could get Max to a vet. Returning to the living room, John knelt beside Max's bed. The dog whimpered softly as John approached, his tail giving a weak wag. "Easy, Max," John soothed, gently running, his hand over the dog's head. "I'm going to clean you up a bit, all right?" John carefully examined Max's injuries in the better light of the cabin. The gash on his flank was nasty, but it didn't appear to be as deep as John had initially feared. The swelling in his hind leg was more concerning. "This might sting a little, buddy," John warned as he began to clean the wound with antiseptic wipes from the first aid kit. Max whined and tried to pull away, but John held him steady. I know, I'm sorry, boy, but we've got to do this. John worked. He spoke softly to Max, partly to keep the dog calm and partly to keep himself focused. He recounted their adventure, his voice breaking occasionally as he relived the terrifying moments. You were so brave, Max, John said, applying antibiotic ointment to the cleaned wound. I don't know what I would have done without you. With the wound cleaned and dressed as best as John could manage, he turned his attention to Max's swollen leg. He gently felt along the limb, trying to determine if there was a break. Max yelped when John's fingers probed a particularly tender spot. Sorry, boy, John murmured. I don't think it's broken, but we'll need the vet to know for sure. John wrapped the leg loosely with a bandage, hoping to provide some support and reduce the swelling. As he worked, he couldn't help but marvel at Max's resilience. Despite the pain he must be in, the dog remained calm, trusting John completely. You're tougher than me, that's for sure, John chuckled softly, giving Max a gentle pat. With Max as comfortable as John could make him, it was time to call for help. John reached for his cell phone only to find it wasn't in his pocket. With a groan, he remembered dropping his backpack during the bear chase. Looks like we'll have to use the landline, Max, John said, pushing himself to his feet with a grunt. He made his way to the kitchen where the old corded phone hung on the wall. As he dialed the number for the local veterinary clinic, John sent up a silent prayer that Dr. Thompson would still be in the office. After several rings, a familiar voice answered. Cody Veterinary Clinic, this is Dr. Thompson. Sarah, thank God, John said, relief evident in his voice. It's John Miller, I need your help. John, what's wrong? You sound terrible. John took a deep breath and launched into a brief explanation of the day's events. As he spoke, he could hear Sarah's sharp intake of breath. John Miller, you are the luckiest fool I know, she said when he finished. Is Max stable right now? I think so, John replied, glancing back at the dog. I've cleaned and bandaged his wounds as best I could. Good. Here's what we're going to do. I'm closing up the clinic now, but I'll grab my emergency kit and come straight to you. It'll take me about 45 minutes to get there. Can you keep Max comfortable until then? Yes, of course, John said, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. Thank you, Sarah. I don't know what I'd do without you. Save the thanks for when I get there, and John, take care of yourself too. You've been through a lot today. As John hung up the phone, he felt some of the tension leave his body. Help. So as on the way, they were going to be okay. He returned to Max's side, settling down on the floor next to the dog bed. The doc's on her way, boy. She'll have you fixed up in no time. Max nudged John's hand with his nose, and John obliged him, with gentle pets. As they waited, John found himself talking to Max, the words spilling out as he processed the day's events. You know, when Sarah and I moved out here, this was exactly the kind of thing she worried about, John said with a rueful chuckle. Bears, mountain lions, all the dangers of living so close to the wilderness. I always told her she was being overcautious. He shook his head, a mix of emotions playing across his face. Guess I owe her an apology, huh? She always was the smarter one of us. As the minutes ticked by, John's adrenaline began to wear off completely, leaving him feeling utterly drained. The aches and pains from his ordeal made themselves known with a vengeance. He shifted uncomfortably, trying to find a position that didn't hurt. Getting too old for this kind of excitement, Max, he groaned. Maybe it's time we took up a nice, safe hobby. What do you think about bird watching? Max huffed in response, and John couldn't help but laugh. Yeah, you're right. We'd both be bored out of our minds in a week. The sound of a car engine cutting through the quiet of the evening made John perk up. Moments later, he heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Cavalry's here, Max, John said, pushing himself to his feet with a groan. He made his way to the front door, opening it just as Dr. Sarah Thompson was about to knock. The veterinarian, a woman in her early 50s with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, took one look at John and shook her head. John Miller, you look like you've been through a war, she said, her tone a mix of concern and exasperation. Feel like it too, John admitted with a weak smile. But I'm not the one you need to worry about. Max is in the living room. Sarah nodded. All business now. She followed John into the cabin, making a beeline for Max. As she knelt to examine the dog, John hovered nearby, anxiety etched on his face. You did a good job with the first aid, Sarah commented, as she carefully removed the bandages John had applied. This could have been much worse. John watched as Sarah worked, her movements efficient and gentle. She cleaned Max's wounds again, applied a better dressing, and gave him a thorough examination, paying special attention to his swollen leg. "Well, the good news is that nothing seems to be broken," Sarah said finally, looking up at John. "He's got some nasty bruising and that gash will take some time to heal, but Max here is one tough cookie." John let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "So he's going to be okay." Sarah nodded, reaching into her bag for some supplies. "With proper care, yes. I'm going to give him an antibiotic injection and something for the pain. You'll need to keep the wounds clean and limit his movement for a while, but he should make a full recovery." As Sarah administered the injections, John felt a wave of emotion wash over him. The reality of how close he'd come to losing Max hit him anew, and he had to blink back tears. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice thick. "I don't know what I would have done if—" Sarah stood up, placing a comforting hand on John's arm. "But you didn't. You both made it through this, John. That's what matters." She looked him over with a critical eye. "Now let's take a look at you. Those cuts need cleaning, and I want to make sure you haven't got any injuries you haven't noticed." As Sarah tended to his scrapes and bruises, John found himself recounting the full story of their encounter with the bear. Sarah listened intently, her expression a mix of horror and amazement. "John," she said when he'd finished, "I hope you realize how incredibly lucky you both were. Promise me you'll be more careful from now on. Carry bear spray, make noise on the trail, all the things they tell tourists but us locals tend to forget." John nodded solemnly. "Believe me, I've learned my lesson. No more complacency in bear country." As Sarah packed up her supplies, she gave John some final instructions for Max's care. "Keep him quiet for the next few days. I'll come by to check on him, but call me immediately if anything changes." John walked her to the door, overwhelming gratitude filling him. "Sarah, I can't thank you enough for coming out here." She smiled, warmly at him. "That's what friends are for, John. Now get some rest, you both need it." As the sound of Sarah's car faded into the distance, John locked the door and returned to Max's side. The dog was already dozing, the pain medication taking effect. John settled down on the couch, not wanting to leave Max alone. As the events of the day replayed in his mind, he felt a complex mix of emotions: fear, gratitude, love for his faithful companion, and a newfound respect for the wild beauty that surrounded his home. "We made it, Max," he whispered, reaching down to gently stroke the dog's head. "We made it." With those words, the exhaustion of the day finally overtook him, and John drifted off into a deep, dreamless sleep. The first rays of sunlight filtering through the cabin windows roused John from his uneasy slumber. For a moment he was disoriented, wondering why he was on the couch instead of in his bed. Then the memories of the previous day came flooding back, and he bolted upright, wincing at the protest from his aching muscles. "Max!" he called out, his voice rough with sleep. A soft whine answered him, and John looked down to see Max still curled up in his bed on the floor. The dog's tail gave a feeble wag as their eyes met. "Hey there, buddy," John said softly, sliding off the couch to sit beside Max. "How are you feeling this morning?" He gently ran his hand over Max's head, careful to avoid the areas where Dr. Thompson had treated him. Max leaned into the touch, seeming to draw comfort from John's presence. "You and me both, boy," John murmured, noting the stiffness in his own limbs. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" As the events of the previous day replayed in his mind, John felt a mix of emotions wash over him: fear, gratitude, and a lingering sense of disbelief. Had it really happened? Had they truly survived a grizzly bear attack? The ache in his muscles and the sight of Max's bandages were stark reminders that it hadn't been a nightmare. They had faced one of nature's most formidable predators and lived to tell the tale. John's ruminations were interrupted by a knock at the door. He stiffened, irrationally fearing for a moment that the bear had somehow followed them home. Then he heard a familiar voice call out, "John, it's Sarah. I've come to check on Max." Relief flooded through him as he called back, "Come on in, Sarah." "Door's open." Dr. Thompson entered, carrying her medical bag. She took one look at John, still in his clothes from yesterday and sporting a spectacular array of bruises, and shook her head. "You look like you've been hit by a truck, John," she said, her tone a mix of concern and exasperation. John managed a wry smile. "Feels like it too, but I'm more worried about Max." Sarah knelt beside the dog bed, her hands already gently probing. "Max's injuries. Let's have a look at our brave boy, shall we?" As Sarah examined Max, John hovered nearby, anxiously watching every move. She checked the wound on Max's flank, nodding approvingly at how it was healing. "The antibiotics seem to be doing their job," she commented. "No signs of infection." When she moved to check Max's injured leg, the dog whimpered softly. John instinctively reached out to comfort him. "Easy, Max," he soothed. "The doc's just trying to help." Sarah worked quickly but gently, her experienced hands assessing the damage. Finally, she sat back on her heels and looked up at John. "Well, the good news is that there's no sign of internal injuries," she said. "The leg is badly bruised, but I don't feel any breaks. With rest and proper care, Max should make a full recovery." John let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank God," he murmured. Sarah stood up, fixing John with a stern look. "Now, let's talk about you. Have you eaten anything since yesterday? Gotten any real sleep?" John sheepishly shook his head. I guess I was too worried about Max," Sarah sighed. "John Miller, you're not going to be any good to Max if you don't take care of yourself. Go take a shower and change your clothes. I'll make you some breakfast." John opened his mouth to protest, but Sarah cut him off with a raised hand. "Doctor's orders. Go on. I'll keep an eye on Max." Recognizing the futility of arguing, John nodded and made his way to the bathroom. As the hot water washed over him, he felt some of the tension begin to leave his body. The events of the previous day seemed almost surreal now, like something out of a movie rather than his own life. When John emerged from the bathroom feeling somewhat more human, he found Sarah in the kitchen, busy at the stove. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air, making his stomach growl loudly. "Sit," Sarah commanded, pointing to the kitchen table. "Eat," John complied, suddenly aware of how ravenous he was. As he dug into the hearty breakfast Sarah had prepared, she sat across from him, her expression serious. "John, we need to talk about what happened yesterday," she said. "Have you reported the bear attack to the Rangers yet?" John paused, a forkful of eggs halfway to his mouth. No, I haven't. With everything that happened with Max, I guess it slipped my mind." Sarah nodded, understanding but firm. "You need to report it. That bear could be a danger to others in the area. The Rangers need to know." John set down his fork, a wave of guilt washing over him. "You're right, of course. I'll call them right after breakfast." As they finished eating, Sarah gave John instructions for Max's care over the next few days. "Keep him quiet, change the bandages daily, and call me if you notice any changes. I'll be back to check on him in a couple of days." John walked her to the door, overwhelmed with gratitude. "Sarah, I can't thank you enough for everything you've done." She smiled warmly at him. "That's what friends are for, John. Just promise me you'll be more careful out there from now on." After Sarah left, John returned to Max's side. The dog looked up at him, his eyes full of trust and affection despite the ordeal they'd been through. "Okay. Boy," John said, reaching for the phone. "Time to make that call." As he dialed the number for the ranger station, John felt a mix of emotions. Part of him dreaded reliving the attack, but he knew it was important to report it. "Yellowstone National Park Ranger Station, this is Ranger Mike speaking. How can I help you?" John took a deep breath. "Hello, this is John Miller. I need to report a bear attack." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "A bear attack. Are you or anyone else injured, sir?" "My dog was hurt, but we're both okay now," John replied. "It happened yesterday on the trail near Miller's Creek." "I see," the ranger said, his voice becoming more serious. "Can you tell me exactly what happened, Mr. Miller?" John began to recount the events of the previous day, his voice shaking slightly as he described the moment the bear charged. As he spoke, he could almost feel the fear and adrenaline coursing through him again. "You're very lucky, Mr. Miller," Ranger Mike said when John finished his story. "Grisly encounters can often end much worse. We'll send a team out to the area to look for signs of the bear and post warnings for other hikers." "Thank you," John said, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. I should have been more careful. I've lived here for years, but I guess I got complacent." "It happens to the best of us," the ranger assured him. "The important thing is that you and your dog are safe, and thank you for reporting this. You may have helped prevent another attack." After hanging up, John returned to Max's side, settling down on the floor next to the dog bed. Max lifted his head, nuzzling John's hand. "Well, boy," John said, gently scratching behind Max's ears, "I guess we're in for a quiet few days while you heal up. How about I read to you for a while?" He reached for a well-worn copy of Call of the Wild from the nearby bookshelf. It had always been one of his favorites. As he began to read aloud, John felt a sense of peace settle over him. They had survived a harrowing ordeal, and while recovery would take time, they were safe. For now, that was enough. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent towards the horizon, John found himself dozing lightly in his armchair. The events of the past day and a half had left him physically and emotionally drained. Max lay nearby, his breathing steady and calm, occasionally twitching in his sleep. A sudden change in the quality of light filtering through the cabin windows roused John from his light slumber. He blinked, disoriented for a moment, before realizing that the sun was now casting long shadows across the room. He'd been asleep longer than he'd intended. "Well, would you look at that, Max?" John murmured, stretching carefully to avoid aggravating his sore muscles. "Seems like we both needed that nap." Max's ears perked up at the sound of John's voice, and he lifted his head slightly, offering a soft whine in response. John leaned forward, gently patting Max's head. "How are you feeling, boy? Think you might be up for a little dinner soon?" If on cue, John's own stomach growled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since the breakfast Sarah had prepared. He chuckled softly, shaking his head at himself. "Guess that answers that question for both of us, huh?" Carefully, John pushed himself to his feet, wincing slightly at the stiffness in his joints. He made his way to the kitchen, keeping one eye on Max as he moved. The dog seemed content to stay in his bed, which was probably for the best given his injuries. As John began to prepare a simple meal for himself and some soft food for Max, his mind wandered back to the events of the previous day. The memory of the bear's charge, the fear that had gripped him as he ran for his life, the agonizing hours spent in the tree. It all seemed almost surreal now, like a vivid nightmare rather than something that had actually happened. He was pulled from his reverie by the sound of a vehicle approaching outside. John tensed instinctively, his nerves still on edge from the bear encounter. He moved to the window, peering out cautiously. Relief washed over him as he recognized the forest green truck pulling up in front of his cabin. It was Ranger Mike, likely, coming to follow up on the report John had made earlier. John quickly finished preparing Max's food, setting it down near the dog's bed before heading to the door. He opened it just as Ranger Mike was about to knock. "Mr. Miller," the ranger greeted him with a nod. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." John shook his head, stepping back to allow the ranger inside. "Not at all. I was just about to have some dinner. Would you like to come in?" Ranger Mike accepted the invitation, following John into the cabin. His eyes immediately fell on Max, who was now alert and watching the newcomer warily. "This must be the brave dog I heard about," the ranger said, his voice softening as he addressed Max. "Hello there, fella. You've had quite an adventure, haven't you?" John couldn't help but smile at the gentle way the ranger spoke to Max. "That's Max. He's the real hero of this story. If it wasn't for him, I might not be here to tell the tale." Ranger Mike nodded solemnly. "Dogs often are the unsung heroes in situations like these. How's he doing?" "Better than I'd feared," John replied, moving to sit in his armchair. He gestured for the ranger to take a seat on the couch. "The vet says he should make a full recovery, with rest and care." The ranger sat, pulling out a small notebook. "That's good to hear. Now, Mr. Miller, I hope you don't mind, but I'd like to go over your account of the bear encounter again. Sometimes details come back to people after the initial shock wears off." John nodded, settling back in his chair. "Of course. Where would you like me to start?" For the next hour, John recounted the events of the previous day in painstaking detail. Ranger Mike listened attentively, occasionally asking questions to clarify certain points. As John spoke, he found that the ranger was right. There were details he remembered now that he hadn't thought to mention in his initial report. "The bear's coat," John said suddenly, interrupting himself mid-sentence. "I just remembered. It had a distinctive patch of lighter fur on its right shoulder. Almost looked like a crescent moon shape." Ranger Mike's eyebrows rose as he jotted this down. "That's excellent, Mr. Miller. Details like that can be crucial in identifying specific animals. Anything else you can recall about its appearance?" John closed his eyes, trying to picture the bear clearly in his mind. "It was big, bigger than any bear I've seen around here before, and its left ear, I think it might have been torn or notched somehow." The ranger nodded, making more notes. "This is all very helpful, Mr. Miller. We've had reports of a bear matching this description in the area before. Your encounter might help us locate and possibly relocate this animal before it causes any more trouble." As their conversation wound down, Ranger Mike stood, tucking his notebook away. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Miller. Your detailed account will be very useful in our investigation." John walked the ranger to the door, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. As they reached the threshold, Ranger Mike turned to face him once more. "Mr. Miller, I know this has been a traumatic experience for you," he said, his tone serious but kind. "But I want you to know that encounters like this are rare. With proper precautions, the woods can still be a safe and enjoyable place." John nodded, appreciating the ranger's words. "Thank you. I admit the thought of going back out there is, well, it's a bit daunting right now." Ranger Mike smiled understandingly. "That's perfectly natural. Take your time, and when you do feel ready to hit the trails again, don't hesitate to stop by the station. We'd be happy to go over some safety measures with you, maybe even accompany you on your first hike back." As the ranger's truck disappeared down the dirt road, John closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a long breath. The conversation had stirred up the memories of the attack, bringing back the fear and adrenaline he'd felt in those terrifying moments. He made his way back to Max, kneeling beside the dog's bed. Max looked up at him, his tail thumping softly against the cushion. "What do you think, boy?" John asked, scratching Max gently behind the ears. "Think we'll ever be ready to go back out there?" Max whined softly, leaning into John's touch. In that moment, looking into his faithful companion's eyes, John felt a spark of the old excitement he used to feel about their woodland adventures. "You're right," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We can't let fear keep us locked up in here forever. But for now, how about we just focus on getting you better, huh?" As the last light of day faded outside, John settled back into his armchair with a book, Max dozing contentedly nearby. The bear was still out there somewhere, a reminder of the wild and sometimes dangerous beauty of their home. But for now, in the warmth and safety of their cabin, that danger seemed far away. John knew that eventually they would have to face their fears and return to the trails they loved. But that was a challenge for another day. Tonight, he was content to simply be thankful for their survival and the quiet comfort of each other's company. The first light of dawn was just beginning to paint the sky when John stirred from his fitful sleep. He blinked, momentarily disoriented before the events of the past 2 days came rushing back. With a groan, he pushed himself up from the couch where he'd spent another night, unwilling to leave Max alone. "Morning, boy," John murmured, his voice still rough with sleep. He leaned over to check on Max, who was already awake, his tail thumping softly against his bed at the sound of John's voice. John carefully examined Max's wounds, relieved to see no signs of infection. The swelling in his leg seemed to have gone down a bit, though the dog still whimpered softly when John gently touched the area. "Easy there, buddy," John soothed. "You're doing great. How about we try to get you outside for a bit, huh?" Max's ears perked up at the word outside, and he made an attempt to stand. John quickly moved to support him, helping the dog to his feet. "Nice and slow, Max. We're not in any hurry." Together, they made their way to the cabin door. John's hand hesitated on the doorknob, a sudden wave of anxiety washing over him. The last time they'd stepped outside together, they'd nearly lost their lives. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Come on, John," he muttered to himself. "It's just the front yard. Nothing to be afraid of." With a determined nod, he opened the door. The cool morning air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. John and Max stepped out onto the porch, both moving gingerly. As Max took care of his business, John scanned the tree line, his body tense and alert for any sign of movement. The forest seemed peaceful in the early morning light, but John couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. "All right, Max," John said after a few minutes. "Let's head back inside. That's enough excitement for now." Once back in the safety of the cabin, John busied himself with making breakfast and tending to Max's needs. As he worked, his mind kept drifting, back to their brief time outside. The anxiety he'd felt was troubling. How would he ever feel safe in the woods again? A knock at the door startled John out of his thoughts. He approached cautiously, relaxing only when he heard Dr. Thompson's voice calling out, "John, it's Sarah. I'm here to check on Max." John opened the door, managing a small smile for the vet. "Morning, Sarah. Come on in." Sarah entered, her eyes immediately going to Max. "And how's our patient doing today?" As Sarah examined Max, John hovered nearby, watching every move intently. She checked the wounds, tested the range of motion in Max's injured leg, and generally gave him a thorough once-over. Finally, she straightened up, a satisfied look on her face. "He's healing nicely, John. The swelling's gone down, and there's no sign of infection. You've been taking good care of him." John let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "That's a relief. When do you think he'll be back to normal?" Sarah considered for a moment. "It's hard to say for certain, but given his progress, I'd estimate another week or two before he's ready for short walks. It'll be a bit longer before he's up for your usual hikes, though." At the mention of hiking, John felt a knot form in his stomach. Sarah, ever perceptive, noticed his change in demeanor. "John," she said gently, "have you thought about when you might venture back out on the trails?" John shook his head, moving to sit heavily in his armchair. "Honestly, Sarah, I don't know if I can. Every time I even think about it, I feel this panic." Sarah sat on the couch across from him, her expression sympathetic but firm. "That's a normal reaction after what you've been through. But John, you can't let fear keep you prisoner in your own home." "I know," John sighed, running a hand through his hair. "But how do I get past it? Every time I look at those trees, all I can see is that bear charging at us." Sarah leaned forward, her voice kind but determined. "You take it. One step at a time. Start small, maybe just sit on the porch for a while each day. When you're ready, take a short walk around the yard. Build up your confidence gradually." John nodded slowly, considering her words. "And what about Max? I can't help but worry about taking him out there again." "Max will follow your lead," Sarah assured him. "Dogs are resilient, and they pick up on our emotions. If you're calm and confident, he'll feel the same." They talked for a while longer, Sarah offering practical advice and emotional support. By the time she left, John felt a glimmer of hope that he hadn't experienced since the attack. After Sarah's departure, John found himself standing at the window, looking out at the forest that had once been his sanctuary. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, sunlight dappling the ground beneath them. It was a beautiful sight, but John couldn't ignore the undercurrent of fear that still ran through him. "What do you think, Max?" he said, glancing down at the dog who had limped over to join him. "Think we can do this?" Max looked up at him, his brown eyes full of trust, and let out a soft woof. John couldn't help but smile. "Yeah, I think so too. We've got to try at least." With a deep breath, John made a decision. He walked to the front door, Max following. Close behind, pausing with his hand on the doorknob, John closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his courage. "Okay," he murmured. "Here goes nothing." He opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, Max at his side. The sounds and smells of the forest washed over him, the chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves, the scent of pine and wildflowers. John felt his heart rate quicken, but he forced himself to take slow, deep breaths. They didn't go far, just to the edge of the porch. But as John stood there, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face and the solid presence of Max beside him, he felt a small sense of accomplishment. "Not so bad, huh, boy?" John said, reaching down to scratch Max behind the ears. They stayed out for about 10 minutes before John's nerves got the better of him and they retreated back inside. But it was a start. As John closed the door behind them, he felt a mix of emotions, pride at taking that first step, lingering fear of what might be lurking in the woods and a tentative hope for the future. "Baby steps, Max," he said, settling back into his armchair. "We'll get there one day at a time." The road to recovery would be long, both for Max's physical injuries and John's emotional scars. But as John sat there, watching the sunlight play across the cabin floor and listening to Max's contented sighs, he felt, for the first time since the attack, that they would be okay. The forest that had nearly taken their lives was still their home, and someday they would find their way back to it. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, John found himself pacing the length of his small cabin. It had been 3 days since the bear attack, and while Max was showing signs of improvement, John's own anxiety seemed to be growing rather than diminishing. He paused by the window, looking out at the forest that had once been his sanctuary, but now felt like a looming threat. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling in a way that used to bring him peace. Now, every movement in. The undergrowth made him flinch. "This can't go on, Max," John said, turning to look at his faithful companion. Max lifted his head from his bed, ears perking up at the sound of John's voice. "We can't live like prisoners in our own home." Making a sudden decision, John reached for the phone. His fingers hesitated over the keypad for a moment before he steeled himself and dialed. "Yellowstone National Park Ranger Station. This is Ranger Mike speaking. How can I help you?" "Ranger Mike, it's John Miller," John said, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. I was wondering if I could come down to the station today. I think I need to talk to someone about what happened." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Ranger Mike spoke again, his voice was filled with understanding. "Of course, Mr. Miller. We're here to help. How about you come by around 2 p.m.? I'll make sure I'm available." John agreed, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. After hanging up, he turned to Max. "What do you say, boy? Feel up to a little car ride?" Max's tail thumped against his bed, and John couldn't help but smile. At least one of them was looking forward to getting out of the cabin. The drive to the ranger station was tense for John. Every curve in the road made him grip the steering wheel tighter, half expecting a bear to come lumbering out of the woods. Max, on the other hand, seemed to be enjoying the change of scenery, his nose pressed against the passenger window. As they pulled into the parking lot of the ranger station, John took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. "Okay, Max. Let's do this." Inside, they were greeted by a friendly receptionist who directed them to Ranger Mike's office. The ranger stood as they entered, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Mr. Miller, good to see you," he said, extending his hand. His eyes fell on Max, who was limping slightly but wagging his tail. "And this must be the brave Max. How are you both doing?" John shook the ranger's hand, managing a small smile. "We're getting there. Max is healing well, but He trailed off, unsure how to express the turmoil he was feeling. Ranger Mike nodded understandingly, gesturing for John to take a seat. "It's not uncommon to struggle after an experience like yours, Mr. Miller. Why don't you tell me what's been going on?" For the next hour, John poured out his fears and anxieties. He described the panic he felt every time he looked at the forest, the nightmares that plagued his sleep, and the guilt he carried for putting Max in danger. Ranger Mike listened attentively, occasionally asking questions or offering words of reassurance. When John finally fell silent, the ranger leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. "Mr. Miller, what you're feeling is a normal response to trauma," he said. "But it's important to remember that bear attacks, especially unprovoked ones, like you experienced, are extremely rare. The woods aren't inherently dangerous, but they do require respect and preparation." John nodded, absorbing the ranger's words. "I know that, logically. But every time I think about going back out there, it's scary," Ranger Mike finished for him. "And that's okay. The key is not to let that fear control you. Have you considered speaking with a counselor who specializes in trauma?" John shook his head. "I hadn't thought about it." "It might be helpful," the ranger suggested. "In the meantime, I have an idea that might help you regain some confidence. We're running a bear safety workshop next week. It covers everything from proper food storage to using bear spray effectively. Would you be interested in attending?" John hesitated for a moment before nodding. I think I think that might be good. Maybe if I feel more prepared, it won't be so frightening. Ranger Mike smiled encouragingly. That's the spirit, and Mr. Miller, remember, you're not alone in this. We're here to support you, and so is your community. As if on cue, there was a knock at the office door. A young woman poked her head in, her eyes widening as she saw John. "Oh, Mr. Miller. I'm so glad you're here," she said, stepping into the office. "I'm Jenny from the Cody Enterprise. We heard about your bear encounter, and we were hoping you might be willing to share your story with our readers." John felt a surge of panic at the thought of recounting his experience for public consumption. But as he looked at Ranger Mike's encouraging nod and felt Max's comforting presence at his feet, he realized that sharing his story might be an important step in his healing process. I suppose I could do that," John said hesitantly. "But I want to make sure it's not sensationalized. This isn't about demonizing bears or scaring people away from the park. It's about promoting safety and respect for wildlife." Jenny nodded enthusiastically. "Of course, Mr. Miller. That's exactly the angle we want to take. Your experience could help educate others and potentially prevent similar incidents." As they discussed the details of the interview, John felt a small spark of purpose ignite within him. Maybe by sharing his story, he could help others avoid the trauma he'd experienced. Maybe this was a way to find meaning in what had happened. When they left the ranger station later that afternoon, John felt lighter than he had in days. The fear wasn't gone, but it felt more manageable now. He had a plan: attend the bear safety workshop, share his story with the local paper, and take small steps to rebuild his confidence in the outdoors. As they drove home, John glanced at Max, who was dozing peacefully in the passenger seat. "We're going to be okay, boy," he said softly. "It'll take time, but we'll get there." The trees lining the road still made John nervous, but for the first time since the attack, he could imagine a future where the forest wasn't just a source of fear. It would be a long journey, but with Max by his side and the support of his community, John felt ready to take the first steps towards reclaiming the life he loved. The morning of the interview dawned clear and crisp, a typical autumn day in Cody, Wyoming. John Miller stood on his front porch, coffee mug in hand, gazing out at the forest that surrounded his cabin. The trees, ablaze with fall colors, swayed gently in the breeze. It was a sight that once filled him with peace, but now stirred a complex mix of emotions: fear, longing, and a tentative hope. "Well, Max," John said, glancing down at his faithful companion lounging at his feet, "today's the big day. You ready for your 15 minutes of fame?" Max's tail thumped against the wooden porch in response, bringing a small smile to John's face. The dog's wounds had healed remarkably well over the past week, though he still favored his previously injured leg slightly. As John sipped his coffee, he rehearsed the story in his mind once more. Jenny from the Cody Enterprise would be arriving in an hour to conduct the interview. Despite his initial reservations, John had come to see this as an opportunity, a chance to educate others, and perhaps find some closure for himself. The sound of tires on gravel pulled John from his thoughts. A small blue sedan was making its way up his driveway, arriving earlier than expected. John set down his coffee mug and made his way down the porch steps, Max following close behind. Jenny stepped out of the car, a friendly smile on her face. She was younger than John had expected, probably in her late 20s, with a notebook tucked under one arm and a camera hanging around her neck. "Mr. Miller," she called out, extending her hand as she approached. "I hope you don't mind that I'm a bit early. I wanted to get some photos of your property for the article, if that's all right." John shook her hand, nodding. "That's fine, Jenny. And please, call me John." "Mr. Miller makes me feel older than I already am." Jenny laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "John it is then, and this must be the heroic Max I've heard about." She knelt down, allowing Max to sniff her hand before gently patting his head. John watched, a warmth spreading in his chest at the sight of Max's easy acceptance of the stranger. It was a far cry from the wary, pain-filled dog of a week ago. "Shall we get started?" Jenny asked, straightening up. "I thought we could do the interview on your porch if you're comfortable with that. It'll make for a nice backdrop." John hesitated. For a moment, his eyes darting to the tree line. The forest suddenly seemed to loom larger, more threatening. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Actually, I have a better idea. Why don't we take a short walk? There's a clearing not far from here where it all happened. Might help set the scene better. Jenny's eyes widened in surprise. Are you sure? I don't want to make you uncomfortable. John managed a small smile. I'm sure. It's time I faced this head on. As they set off down the trail, John found himself hyper-aware of every sound, every movement in the undergrowth. Max trotted ahead, seemingly unbothered by their return to the scene of their harrowing encounter. John envied his dog's resilience. So, John, Jenny began as they walked, her voice gentle. Why don't you start by telling me about that day? What was different about it? John took a deep breath, the memories washing over him. It started like any other day, really. Max and I, we've been taking this same walk every morning for years. You get complacent, you know. Start to forget that. You're in wild country. As they reached the clearing, John paused, his eyes scanning the area. It looked so peaceful now, dappled sunlight playing across the forest floor. Hard to believe it had been the site of such terror. It was right here, John said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. We had just entered the clearing when we heard it, a low growl that made my blood run cold. Jenny listened intently, jotting notes as John recounted the heart-stopping moments of the bear's charge, Max's brave distraction, and the agonizing hours John spent trapped in a tree. I've never been so scared in my life, John admitted, his hands shaking slightly at the memory. But Mac, he saved my life, gave me the chance to escape. Jenny's eyes were wide as she absorbed the story. That's incredible, John. You both showed such bravery. How has this experience changed your relationship with nature? John was quiet for a moment, considering the question. It's complicated. For a while there, I was terrified to even step outside my cabin. The forest that had been my home, my sanctuary, suddenly felt like enemy territory. He paused, looking around the clearing. A squirrel darted across their path, and a pair of birds called to each other from the treetops. But being out here now, telling this story, I'm realizing that the forest itself isn't the enemy. It's wild, yes, and sometimes dangerous, but it's also beautiful and vital. We just need to remember our place in it, to respect it. Jenny nodded, scribbling furiously in her notebook. That's a powerful message, John. Do you have any advice for others who might find themselves in a similar situation? Be prepared, John said without hesitation. Carry bear spray, make noise on the trail, know what to do if you encounter a bear. But most importantly, don't let fear keep you from experiencing the beauty of the wild. Just respect it, and remember that we're visitors in their home. As they made their way back to the cabin, John felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. Telling his story, facing his fears by returning to the scene of the attack. It felt like a turning point. Back on the porch, Jenny snapped a few final photos of John and Max together. As she packed up her equipment, she turned to John with a warm smile. Thank you for sharing your story, John. I think it's going to make a real impact. John nodded, reaching down to scratch Max behind the ears. I hope so. If it helps even one person stay safe out there, or help someone else who's been through something similar, well, then maybe some good can come out of all this. As Jenny's car disappeared down the driveway, John settled into his favorite porch chair, Max curling up at his feet. He looked out at the forest, really seeing it for the first time since the attack. The fear was still there, a low hum in the back of his mind, but it no longer overwhelmed him. What do you say, Max? John said softly. Think we might be ready for a real walk soon? Max's tail thumped against the porch boards, his eyes bright and eager. John couldn't help but laugh. Yeah, I think so too, boy. Baby steps, but we'll get there. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, John felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road to recovery was far from over, but for the first time since the attack he could see the path forward. With Max by his side and the support of his community, John knew they would find their way back to the life they loved. Wiser, more cautious perhaps, but no less in awe of the wild beauty that surrounded them. The early morning mist hung low over the forest, casting an ethereal glow as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. John Miller stood on his porch, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands, watching as the world slowly came to life around him. It had been 6 weeks since the bear attack, and today marked a significant milestone in his recovery. "Well, Max," John said, glancing down at his faithful companion, "what do you say we give it a try today?" Max, fully recovered from his injuries, wagged his tail enthusiastically. His brown eyes looked up at John with unwavering trust and excitement. John took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. Today would be their first attempt at a real walk in the woods since the attack. He'd been building up to this, moment gradually, starting with short strolls around the yard, then venturing a little further each day. But this was different. As he finished his coffee, John ran through a mental checklist. Bear spray? Check. Whistle? Check. Fully charged cell phone? Check. He'd attended the Rangers' bear safety workshop and had practiced with the spray until he felt confident in its use. Still, a flutter of anxiety stirred in his stomach. "All right, boy," John said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "Let's do this." They set off down the familiar trail, John's senses hyper-aware of every sound and movement around them. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustle of branches in the breeze, the distant call of a bird. Each noise made him tense momentarily before he forced himself to relax. Max trotted ahead, nose to the ground, seemingly oblivious to John's anxiety. His carefree demeanor helped ease some of John's tension. If Max could face the forest without fear after what they'd been through, surely he could too. As they walked, John found his thoughts drifting to the events of the past weeks. The article in the Cody Enterprise had generated quite a buzz in the community. People he barely knew had stopped him in the grocery store to share their own wildlife encounters or to thank him for raising awareness about bear safety. One conversation in particular stood out in his memory. An older woman had approached him with tears in her eyes, telling him how his story had given her the courage to start hiking again after her own frightening encounter with a moose years ago. "You reminded me that fear shouldn't keep us from living," she had said, squeezing his hand. "Thank you for that." The trail curved sharply, and John found himself facing the clearing where the attack had occurred. He paused, his heart rate quickening. Max stopped too, looking back at him with a quizzical tilt of his head. "It's okay, Max," John murmured, more to himself than to the dog. "We're okay." Taking a deep breath, John stepped into the clearing. It looked different now. Wildflowers dotted the grass, and sunlight dappled the ground through the canopy above. It was beautiful, peaceful, even. John felt a complex mix of emotions wash over him. Fear, yes, but also a sense of triumph at facing this place again. They continued on, the trail winding deeper into the forest. John found himself relaxing more with each step, his eyes taking in the beauty around him, rather than constantly scanning for threats. The familiar sense of pine and earth filled his nostrils, bringing back memories of countless happy hikes before the attack. About an hour into their walk, they reached a small stream. John decided this was a good place for a break. He sat on a fallen log, watching as Max lapped at the cool water. "We're doing pretty well, huh, boy?" John said, reaching for his water bottle. As he took a swig, a sudden rustling in the nearby bushes made him freeze. His hand instinctively went to the bear spray on his belt. Max's ears perked up, his body tensing. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. John's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the moving foliage, half expecting a massive grizzly to emerge at any second. Instead, a young deer stepped cautiously into view. It regarded John and Max warily for a moment before bending its head to drink from the stream. John let out a shaky laugh, the tension draining from his body. "False alarm, Max," he said, patting the dog's head. "Just Bambi coming for a drink." They watched the deer for a few minutes before it disappeared back into the forest. As John stood to continue their hike, he realized something had shifted within him. The panic he'd felt at the rustling bushes had been brief, manageable. He'd reacted calmly, remembering his training. Progress, he thought with a small smile. The return journey seemed easier somehow. John found himself noticing things he'd missed on the way out. The intricate pattern of lichen on a boulder, the vibrant red of a cardinal flitting between branches, the sweet scent of late-blooming wildflowers. As they neared home, John spotted Ranger Mike's truck parked in front of his cabin. The ranger was leaning against it, a broad smile spreading across his face as he saw John and Max emerge from the trail. "Well, look at you two," Ranger Mike called out. "Conquering the great outdoors again, I see." John couldn't help but grin as they approached. "Figured it was about time we got back out there. What brings you by?" "Just wanted to check in, see how you were doing," the ranger replied. His eyes twinkled as he added, "And maybe to make sure you hadn't decided to become a hermit after all." John chuckled, shaking his head. "Not a chance. It was touch and go for a while there, but—" He paused, looking back at the forest. "This is home. Can't let fear drive us away from that." Ranger Mike nodded approvingly. "Wise words, John. How'd it feel being back on the trail?" "Scary at first," John admitted, "but also right, like I was reclaiming a part of myself." They chatted for a while longer, John recounting their encounter with the deer and how he'd managed his momentary panic. As Ranger Mike prepared to leave, he turned to John with a serious expression. "You know, John, what you've done, facing your fears, sharing your story, it's made a real difference. We've seen an uptick in people taking bear safety courses, buying proper gear. You might have saved some lives with your experience." John felt a warmth spread through his chest at the ranger's words. "I'm just glad something good could come out of it all," he said softly. After Ranger Mike left, John settled into his favorite porch chair, Max sprawling at his feet. He looked out at the forest, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. The trees no longer seemed menacing. Instead, they stood as silent sentinels, familiar and almost welcoming. "We did it, Max," John said, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "First of many walks to come, I think." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, John felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The memory of the bear attack would always be with him, a reminder of the wild's power and unpredictability. But it no longer controlled him. He had faced his fears, step by step, and found his way back to the life he loved. With Max by his side, and the forest stretching out before them, John Miller felt ready for whatever adventures lay ahead, armed with respect, caution, and an unwavering love for the wild beauty of his home. Now let's go to the next attack case. If you're enjoying it, leave a like and a comment telling me which city you're watching from. Let's move on to the next one. Rachel Bennett pulled her weathered Jeep Cherokee into the gravel parking lot of Glacier National Park's Apgar Visitor Center. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. She took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp mountain air tinged with the scent of pine. This was her element, where she felt most alive. As she stepped out of the vehicle, her hiking boots crunched on the gravel. Rachel stretched, working out the kinks from the long drive from Missoula. At 33, she was in peak physical condition, her body honed by years of trekking through wilderness in pursuit of the perfect shot. "Another day, another adventure," she murmured to herself, a smile playing on her lips. Rachel opened the rear hatch of her Jeep, revealing an organized chaos of camping gear and photography equipment. She pulled out her backpack, double-checking its contents. First aid kit, extra layers, water purification tablets, and enough trail mix to last a week. Next came her prized possession, a top-of-the-line DSLR camera with an assortment of lenses, carefully packed in a padded case. As she shouldered her pack, a park ranger approached, clipboard in hand. "Evening, Mum," he greeted her with a friendly nod. "Heading out for some camping?" Rachel smiled back. "That's right. Planning to spend a few days tracking the elk herds. I'm a wildlife photographer," she added, patting her camera case. The ranger's expression turned serious. "I'll need you to fill out a backcountry permit, and I hope you're aware of the bear situation out there?" "Oh, absolutely," Rachel assured him. "I've got bear spray and I know the drill. Make noise, store food properly, and give them a wide berth if I spot any." The ranger seemed satisfied. "Good to hear. We've had a few grizzly sightings in the area recently, so stay alert. Fill this out for me, please," he said, handing her the clipboard. As Rachel filled out the permit, the ranger continued. "So, elk herds, huh? Any particular shots you're hoping to get?" Rachel's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "I'm working on a series about wildlife in changing seasons. I'm hoping to catch the elk in the golden light of dusk or dawn, maybe with some fall colors in the background. If I'm really lucky, I might even catch some rutting behavior." The ranger chuckled. "Sounds like you know your stuff." Just remember, the animals have the right of way out here. Don't go putting yourself in danger for a photo, no matter how good it might be. Don't worry, Rachel replied, handing back the clipboard. I've been doing this for years. I know how to keep my distance. With the formalities taken care of, Rachel set off toward the campground. She had a few hours of daylight left. Enough. Time to set up camp and maybe scout out some potential shooting locations for the morning. The campground was relatively quiet, with only a few other tents scattered among the trees. Rachel found a spot with a good view of the surrounding forest and began to set up her tent with practiced efficiency. As she worked, she couldn't help but feel a tingle of excitement. This was always her favorite part of any trip, the anticipation of what she might capture through her lens. With her tent secured, Rachel set about organizing her gear. She laid out her camera equipment, checking each piece meticulously. Satisfied that everything was in order, she pulled out her map of the park and spread it on the ground in front of her tent. Okay, let's see what we've got, she muttered to herself, tracing potential routes with her finger. She marked a few promising locations, areas where the elk were likely to gather based on her research and past experience. As the light began to fade, Rachel fired up her portable camp stove and prepared a simple meal of dehydrated pasta. She sat at the entrance of her tent, eating slowly as she watched the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. A rustling in the nearby bushes caught her attention. Rachel tensed for a moment, her hand instinctively moving toward her bear spray. But it was only a deer, moving cautiously through the campground. She laughed softly at her own jumpiness. "Get it together, Rachel," she chided herself. "You're not going to get very far if you spook at every little sound." After cleaning up her dinner and securing all her food in a bear-proof container well away from her tent, Rachel settled in for the night. She set her alarm for an hour before sunrise, wanting to be in position when the first light of dawn broke over the mountains. As she lay in her sleeping bag, Rachel's mind raced with possibilities. What would tomorrow bring? Would she find the elk herd? Would the light be right for the shots she envisioned? And always, in the back of her mind, was the thrill of potential danger, the knowledge that in this wilderness, she was not at the top of the food chain. "That's what makes it exciting," she whispered to herself as she drifted off to sleep. "You never know what's going to happen out here." The night passed uneventfully, the silence of the forest broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant howl of a wolf. Rachel slept soundly, her body accustomed to the hard ground and the ambient sounds of nature. When her alarm chirped softly in the pre-dawn darkness, Rachel was awake in an instant, her excitement overriding any lingering drowsiness. She dressed, quickly in layers, knowing the morning would be chilly but that she'd warm up once she started hiking. Outside the tent, the world was still shrouded in darkness, the stars still visible overhead. Rachel took a moment to appreciate the view, breathing deeply of the cool pine-scented air. "This is why I do this," she thought, feeling a sense of peace wash over her, but there was no time to linger. Rachel wolfed down a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, then set about packing her day bag. Camera, extra lenses, tripod, water, snacks, first aid kit, bear spray. She checked each item off her mental list as she packed. Just as the first hints of light began to appear on the eastern horizon, Rachel was ready to go. She clipped her bear spray to her belt, easily accessible, and shouldered her pack. "All right, Glacier," she said aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Show me what you've got." With a final glance at her map, Rachel set off down the trail, her headlamp illuminating the path ahead. She moved quietly, but not silently, occasionally calling out, "Hey, bear!" to alert any nearby animals of her presence. As she hiked, the forest around her gradually came to life. Birds began their morning songs, small animals rustled in the underbrush, and the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the trees. Rachel paused at a clearing, watching in awe as the rising sun painted the distant peaks in shades of gold and pink. She quickly set up her tripod and snapped a few shots, knowing that while this wasn't her primary objective, it was too beautiful a scene to pass up. "Just a taste of what's to come," she told herself, grinning as she reviewed the images on her camera's display. Energized by the beautiful morning and the promise of what lay ahead, Rachel continued her journey into the heart of Glacier National Park. She was alert, excited, and completely unaware of the danger that awaited her in the wilderness she loved so much. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Rachel Bennett pushed deeper into the backcountry of Glacier National Park. The crisp morning air had given way to the warmth of early autumn, and she had already shed her outer layer, stuffing it into her backpack as she hiked. Her eyes scanned the forest floor, searching for signs of elk. Fresh droppings, trampled vegetation, and the occasional hoofprint told her she was on the right track. Rachel's excitement grew with each piece of evidence she found. "They can't be far now," she muttered to herself, pausing to take a swig of water from her canteen. The trail she followed wound through a dense stand of pines before opening up into a small meadow. Rachel crouched at the edge of the tree line, her keen eyes surveying the open space. There, at the far end of the clearing, she spotted them, a small group of elk grazing peacefully. Her heart raced as she slowly, deliberately reached for her camera. With practiced movements, she attached her telephoto lens and adjusted her settings. The elk were still unaware of her presence, offering her the perfect opportunity to capture them in their natural state. Rachel raised her camera, peering through the viewfinder. The morning light was perfect, casting a golden glow over the scene. She began to shoot, the quiet click of her shutter, the only sound breaking the tranquil silence of the meadow. After several minutes, Rachel lowered her camera, a satisfied smile playing on her lips. She had captured some beautiful shots, but she knew there was potential for even better ones. The herd she had found was small, likely just a fraction of the larger group she had heard about from other photographers and park rangers. Consulting her map, Rachel plotted a course that would take her to a series of connected meadows, where the elk were known to gather in larger numbers. It would be a challenging hike, taking her far from the marked trails, but the prospect of capturing truly spectacular images was too tempting to resist. As she set off again, Rachel's mind wandered to the potential dangers of venturing so far, into the backcountry alone. She had encountered bears before in her years of wildlife photography, but always from a safe distance. The warnings from the park ranger the previous evening echoed in her mind. "Stop it," she chided herself aloud. "You know what you're doing. Just stay alert and trust your instincts." The terrain became more challenging as Rachel moved away from the established trails. She climbed over fallen logs, picked her way across small streams, and navigated through dense underbrush. Despite the difficulty, she felt exhilarated. This was what she lived for: the thrill of exploration, the connection with nature in its rawest form. As the day wore on, Rachel began to notice more and more signs of elk activity. Tracks crisscrossed the forest floor, and in some areas, the vegetation showed clear signs of heavy grazing. She was getting close. Pausing to catch her breath and check her bearings, Rachel noticed something that made her pulse quicken. There, in a patch of soft earth, was a track that definitely didn't belong to an elk. It was a bear print, large, with clear claw marks visible. "Grizzly," Rachel whispered, crouching down to examine the print more closely. It looked fresh. For a moment she considered turning back. The sensible thing would be to return to more frequented areas of the park, but the photographer in her, the part that always pushed for that one perfect shot, urged her forward. She had her bear spray, she reasoned, and she knew how to behave in bear country. After a brief internal struggle, Rachel's passion won out over caution. She stood, took a deep breath, and continued on her path, albeit with heightened awareness of her surroundings. As the afternoon sun began its descent towards the western horizon, Rachel finally heard what she had been hoping for: the distinctive bugle of a bull elk. The sound echoed through the trees, sending a shiver of excitement down her spine. Moving as quietly as she could, Rachel made her way towards the source of the sound. As she crested a small rise, she saw them, a vast meadow filled with elk. There must have been at least 50 animals, including several impressive bulls with massive antlers. "Jackpot," Rachel breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. Carefully, she set up her tripod at the edge of the meadow, using a cluster of bushes for cover. The elk were some distance away, but with her powerful telephoto lens she could capture them in stunning detail. Rachel lost herself in her work, her camera clicking away as she captured image after image. She photographed the bulls as they bugled, and postured, the cows as they grazed peacefully, and the playful antics of the younger elk. So focused was she on her subjects that Rachel failed to notice the lengthening shadows and the gradual cooling of the air. It wasn't until she finally lowered her camera, her arms aching from holding it steady for so long, that she realized how late it had gotten. "Shit," she muttered, glancing at her watch. She had been so engrossed in photographing the elk that she had lost track of time. The sun was now low on the horizon, and she was miles from her campsite. Rachel quickly packed up her gear, her mind racing as she tried to determine the best course of action. Hiking back in the dark would be dangerous, especially with the knowledge that there were bears in the area. On the other hand, she wasn't equipped for an overnight stay in the backcountry. After a moment's consideration, Rachel decided to start making her way back. She had a headlamp, and if she moved quickly, she might make it to more familiar territory before full darkness set in. As she set off, Rachel couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. She was thrilled with the images she had captured. They were possibly some of the best of her career. But she was also angry with herself for losing track of time and putting herself in this potentially dangerous situation. The forest seemed different in the fading light. Shadows played tricks on her eyes, and every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made her jump. Rachel found herself constantly scanning her surroundings, one hand never far from her bear spray. "Hey, bear!" she called out periodically, her voice sounding small and insignificant in the vast wilderness. As true darkness fell, Rachel was forced to use her headlamp. The narrow beam of light illuminated the path ahead, but it also made the surrounding darkness seem even more impenetrable. She tried to move as quickly as she safely could, but the unfamiliar terrain and poor visibility slowed her progress. Hours passed, and Rachel's initial confidence began to waver. The landmarks she had noted on her way out now looked different in the darkness, and she found herself second-guessing her route. The realization that she might be lost began to creep in, bringing with it a cold tendril of fear. Just as she was considering stopping to reorient herself, Rachel heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a low, rumbling growl coming from somewhere in the darkness to her left. Rachel froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, carefully, she turned her head, sweeping her headlamp in the direction of the sound. For a brief moment, the beam of light reflected off two eyes, large, predatory eyes that seemed to glow with an inner fire. Then they were gone, blinked out of existence as the creature turned away. "Oh, God," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. The encounter she had both dreaded and, in some secret part of herself, hoped for, was about to become a reality. In the darkness of the Glacier National Park backcountry, Rachel Bennett stood alone, facing an unseen but very real danger. The thrill of the hunt had led her to this moment, and now she would have to draw on every ounce of her experience and courage to survive what was to come. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to calm her racing thoughts. The brief glimpse of those predatory eyes in the darkness had shaken her to her core, but she knew panic would only make the situation worse. Drawing on years of experience in the wilderness, she forced herself to take slow, deep breaths. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself. "Remember your training." Keeping her movements slow and deliberate, Rachel reached for her bear spray, unclipping it from her belt. The weight of the canister in her hand provided a small measure of comfort. She knew it wasn't a guarantee of safety, but it was better than nothing. As her eyes strained against the darkness beyond her headlamp's beam, Rachel's mind raced through her options. Running was out of the question. It would only trigger the bear's predatory instincts. Making herself appear larger might work against a black bear, but if this was a grizzly, as she suspected, it could be seen as a challenge. Suddenly, a rustling sound to her right made Rachel whirl around, her headlamp cutting through the darkness. There, partially obscured by a cluster of bushes, stood an enormous grizzly bear. In the harsh light of her headlamp, its fur appeared almost silver, its small eyes glinting with curiosity and potential aggression. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The bear was massive, easily over 700 pounds, with powerful muscles rippling beneath its thick fur. It was close, too close, perhaps only 30 feet away. Time seemed to stand still as human and bear regarded each other. Rachel's mind flashed to her camera, safely stowed in her backpack. Part of her, The photographer, always in search of the perfect shot, lamented the lost opportunity. But the larger part, the part focused on survival, knew that any movement to retrieve her camera could be disastrous. The grizzly huffed, a deep rumbling sound that Rachel felt as much as heard. It took a step forward, its massive paw leaving an imprint in the soft forest floor. "Hey, bear," Rachel called out, trying to keep her voice steady and calm. "I see you there. I'm just passing through. No need for trouble." The bear paused, tilting its head slightly as if considering her words. For a brief moment, Rachel dared to hope that it might simply lose interest and amble away. But then the wind shifted. A gust blew from behind Rachel, carrying her scent directly to the bear. The grizzly's nostrils flared, and its demeanor changed. Instantly, it dropped onto all fours, its eyes now fixed intently on Rachel. "Oh no," Rachel breathed, realizing what was about to happen a split second before it did. The bear charged. Time seemed to slow down as Rachel watched the massive creature barreling towards her. Her survival training kicked in, overriding the paralyzing fear that threatened to root her to the spot. In one fluid motion, Rachel aimed her bear spray and depressed the trigger, sending a cloud of capsaicin-laced spray towards the oncoming grizzly. The wind, which had betrayed her moments before, now worked in her favor, carrying the spray directly into the bear's face. The effect was immediate. The grizzly reared up on its hind legs, pawing at its eyes and nose, roaring in pain and confusion. But Rachel knew the reprieve would be brief. Bear spray was a deterrent, not a solution, and she needed to put distance between herself and the agitated animal. Turning on her heel, Rachel ran. She abandoned the trail, crashing through the underbrush, her headlamp beam bouncing wildly as she fled. Branches whipped at her face and arms, but she barely felt the stinging cuts they left behind. Her entire world had narrowed to the need to escape. Behind her, she could hear the bear crashing through the forest in pursuit. Its pained roars had turned to angry growls, spurring Rachel to push herself harder. She knew she couldn't outrun the bear, no human could, but she hoped to find some kind of shelter or defensive position. In her panic, Rachel lost all sense of direction. She hurdled fallen logs, splashed through shallow streams, and scrambled up steep inclines, driven purely by adrenaline and the instinct to survive. Just as her lungs were beginning to burn from the exertion, Rachel's foot caught on an exposed root. She stumbled, trying desperately to regain her balance, but the momentum of her headlong flight was too great. She fell, tumbling down a short, steep slope. Pain exploded in her side as she felt, rather than heard, a rib crack upon impact with a partially buried rock. The fall knocked the wind out of her, leaving her gasping for air at the bottom of the slope. For a moment, Rachel lay there, dazed and struggling to breathe. Then the sound of the bear crashing through the underbrush above snapped her back to reality. Gritting her teeth against the pain, she forced herself to her feet. It was then that she saw it, a large fallen tree, its upturned root system creating a small, sheltered space. It wasn't much, but it was the only option she had. Rachel dove for the shelter, just as the bear reached the top of the slope. She wedged herself as far back into the space as she could, making herself as small as possible. The gnarled roots partially obscured her from view, but she knew it was far from a perfect hiding spot. The bear's heavy breathing filled the air as it paused at the top of the slope. Rachel held her own breath, ignoring the stabbing pain in her side, praying that the grizzly would lose interest and move on. But luck was not on her side. Whether guided by sight, sound, or scent, the bear began to make its way down the slope towards her hiding place. Rachel closed her eyes, her mind racing through her limited options. She still had her bear spray, but in this enclosed space, using it would likely incapacitate her as well as the bear. Fighting was out of the question. Against the raw power of a grizzly, she stood no chance. As the bear's shadow fell over her hiding spot, Rachel made a decision. It was risky, counterintuitive even, but it was the only chance she had. She would play dead. Just as the bear's massive form appeared at the entrance to her shelter, Rachel let herself go limp. She fell onto her stomach, lacing her fingers behind her neck to protect it, and held perfectly still. The bear's hot, rancid breath washed over her as it sniffed at her prone form. Rachel fought against every instinct screaming at her to run, to fight, to do something. But she knew that any movement now could trigger a fatal attack. A massive paw batted at her leg, its claws tearing through her pants and into the flesh beneath. Rachel bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood as she fought to remain motionless. The bear huffed and growled, its sounds a mix of aggression and confusion. It pawed at her again, this time raking its claws across her back. The pain was intense, but still Rachel didn't move. Seconds stretched into minutes as the bear continued its investigation. It nosed at her, prodded her with its paws, even mouthed at her backpack. All the while, Rachel remained as still as death, barely daring to breathe. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the bear's interest began to wane. Its movements became less aggressive, its vocalizations less frequent. Rachel felt its presence withdraw from the immediate vicinity of her shelter, but still she didn't move. She knew that bears sometimes fake a departure, only to return if they detect any signs of life from their prey. So Rachel remained motionless, blood seeping from her wounds, her broken ribs sending waves of agony through her body with each shallow breath. As the sounds of the bear faded into the distance, Rachel allowed herself to hope. Had her desperate gambit worked? Was she going to survive this encounter? Only time would tell. For now, all she could do was wait, alone and injured in the darkness of the forest, praying that the bear would not return to finish what it had started. The forest was eerily quiet in the aftermath of the bear attack. Rachel remained motionless in her makeshift shelter, every muscle in her body tense, straining to hear any sign of the grizzly's return. The pain from her injuries throbbed in time with her rapid heartbeat, but she dared not move to assess the damage. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. Gradually, the normal sounds of the forest began to return, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant call of a night bird. Still, Rachel waited, her survival instincts overriding her growing discomfort. Finally, after what must have been at least an hour, Rachel allowed herself to move. Slowly, cautiously, she lifted her head, eyes darting around the small space visible. From her shelter, there was no sign of the bear. "Okay," she whispered to herself, her voice hoarse and shaky. "Okay, you can do this, you have to move." Gritting her teeth against the pain, Rachel carefully extricated herself from the tangle of roots. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through her body, but she forced herself to continue. She couldn't stay here. She needed help. And soon, once free of the shelter, Rachel took stock of her situation. Her backpack was torn but still intact, the bear's teeth having failed to penetrate the rugged material. Her clothes were in tatters, and she could feel warm blood seeping from the wounds on her back and leg. "First things first," Rachel muttered, reaching for her first aid kit with trembling hands. She knew she needed to stop the bleeding before attempting to move any further. As she cleaned and bandaged her wounds as best she could in the dim light of her headlamp, Rachel's mind raced. She was lost, injured, and alone in grisly territory. Her satellite phone was back at her campsite, and she had no idea how far she had run in her panic. "Think, Rachel, think," she urged herself. "What's the first rule of being lost? Stay put." But she knew that wasn't an option. The bear could return at any moment, and in her weakened state, she wouldn't survive another encounter. Her only choice was to try to find her way back to a trail, or better yet, to her campsite. With her wounds dressed, Rachel gathered her belongings. Her camera, miraculously, had survived the ordeal unscathed. A small part of her wished she had managed to get a shot of the bear, but she quickly pushed that thought aside. There were more important things to worry about now. Using a nearby tree for support, Rachel pulled herself to her feet. The world swam before her eyes, and for a moment she thought she might pass out. But she steeled herself, taking deep breaths, until the dizziness passed. "One step at a time," she told herself. "You can do this." Rachel fumbled for her compass, relieved to find it still attached to her belt. She had a general idea of which direction she had come from before the attack. It wasn't much to go on, but it was better than nothing. With agonizing slowness, Rachel began to make her way through the forest. Every step was a battle against pain and exhaustion. The loss of blood had left her weak, and the adrenaline that had fueled her flight was long gone. As she walked, Rachel kept up a constant stream of noise, talking to herself and occasionally calling out, "Hey, bear!" She was desperate to avoid another surprise encounter. "You know," she said aloud, her voice barely above a whisper, "when I said I wanted to get closer to nature, this isn't exactly what I had in mind." The attempt at humor fell flat in the oppressive darkness of the forest, but it helped keep her mind focused, preventing her from dwelling on the pain or the very real danger she was still in. Hours passed, and Rachel's progress slowed to a crawl. She was exhausted, her injuries screaming for attention, but she knew that stopping meant certain death, if not from the cold, then from the bear if it decided to return. Just as she was about to give in to despair, Rachel saw something that made her heart leap. A strip of orange trail marker on a nearby tree. She had found a trail. "Oh, thank God," she breathed, tears of relief springing to her eyes. With renewed determination, Rachel followed the trail markers. She had no idea where this particular trail led, but any marked path was better than wandering aimlessly through the wilderness. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Rachel heard a sound that nearly made her collapse with relief. Voices. Human voices. "Hello," she called out, her voice cracking. "Is someone there? I need help." There was a moment of silence, then a response. "Hello? Where are you?" "Over here," Rachel called back, summoning the last of her strength to move towards the voices. Two figures emerged from the trees, a man and a woman, both dressed in hiking gear. Their eyes widened in shock as they took in Rachel's battered appearance. "Oh my God," the woman gasped. "What happened to you?" "Bear attack," Rachel managed to say, before her legs finally gave out. The man rushed forward, catching her before she hit the ground. "Easy there," he said, lowering her gently. "We've got you. You're safe now." As the woman called for emergency services on her satellite phone, the man tended to Rachel's wounds. She tried to explain what had happened, but exhaustion was quickly overtaking her. "Stay with us," the woman urged, taking Rachel's hand. "Help is on the way. What's your name?" "Rachel," she mumbled. "Rachel Bennett." "Well, Rachel Bennett, you must be one tough lady to have made it this far," the man said, admiration clear in his voice. "Just hang on a little longer, okay?" Rachel nodded weakly, allowing herself to relax for the first time since the attack. As she drifted in and out of consciousness, she became aware of more voices, the whir of helicopter blades. Strong hands lifted her onto a stretcher, and she felt herself being carried. Through half-lidded eyes, she saw the forest fall away as the rescue helicopter lifted off. "My camera," she murmured, reaching out weakly. "My photos—" "Don't worry," a paramedic assured her, securing an oxygen mask over her face. "All your belongings are with you. Just rest now, you're going to be okay." As the helicopter sped towards the nearest hospital, Rachel finally allowed herself to succumb to unconsciousness. Her last coherent thought was of the bear, its power, its ferocity, and the strange beauty of its wild nature. Despite everything, she couldn't bring herself to hate the creature. It was simply being what it was, a force of nature, unpredictable and untamed. In that moment, hovering between consciousness and oblivion, Rachel realized that this encounter, traumatic as it was, had given her a profound connection to the wilderness she loved. It was a story she would carry with her always, etched into her memory and her very flesh. Then the darkness took her, and Rachel Bennett, wildlife photographer and survivor, knew no more. The steady beep of medical equipment was the first sound Rachel Bennett became aware of as she slowly regained consciousness. Her eyelids felt heavy, and it took considerable effort to open them. The stark white ceiling of a hospital room swam into focus, and the events of the past day came rushing back to her in a flood of vivid, terrifying memories. "Oh good, you're awake," a gentle voice said from beside her. Rachel turned her head, slightly wincing at the pain the movement caused, to see a nurse adjusting her IV drip. "How are you feeling, Ms. Bennett?" Rachel tried to speak, but her throat was dry and raw. The nurse quickly offered her a small cup of water with a straw, helping her take a few sips. The cool liquid was a blessed relief. "Like I've been hit by a truck," Rachel finally managed to croak out. "Or mauled by a bear." "Oh wait, that actually happened." The nurse chuckled softly at her attempt at humor. "Well, at least your sense of humor is intact. That's a good sign. I'll let the doctor know you're awake. He'll want to discuss your injuries and treatment plan." As the nurse left, Rachel took stock of her condition. Her entire body ached, with particular pain radiating from her back, leg, and ribs. She was hooked up to various monitors, and her left leg was elevated, wrapped in thick bandages. A few minutes later, a middle-aged man in a white coat entered the room, clipboard in hand. "Ms. Bennett, I'm Dr. Erickson. It's good to see you awake. You gave us quite a scare when you were brought in." Rachel attempted to sit up straighter, but quickly abandoned the effort when pain shot through her side. "How bad is it, Doc?" Dr. Erickson pulled up a chair next to her bed. "Well, you're incredibly lucky, all things considered. You have multiple lacerations on your back and left leg from the bear's claws, which we've cleaned and stitched. There's some muscle damage, but with proper care and physical therapy you should regain full function." He paused, allowing Rachel to absorb the information before continuing. "You also have 2 broken ribs on your right side, likely from your fall during the attack. Fortunately, there was no internal bleeding or organ damage. You lost a fair amount of blood, but the transfusions we gave you have helped stabilize your condition." Rachel nodded slowly, trying to process everything. "What about infection? I've heard that bear attacks often lead to serious infections." "You're right to be concerned," Dr. Erickson replied. "Bear claws can introduce a lot of bacteria into wounds. We've started you on a strong course of antibiotics as a precautionary measure. We'll be monitoring you closely for any signs of infection over the next few days." Just then, there was a knock at the door and a park ranger entered the room. "Excuse me, Doctor. I'm Ranger Mike Holden. I was hoping I could ask Ms. Bennett a few questions about the incident, if she's up for it." Dr. Erickson looked at Rachel questioningly. She nodded, and the doctor stood. "All right, but please keep it brief. Ms. Bennett needs her rest." As the doctor left, Ranger Holden took the vacated seat. "Ms. Bennett, I'm glad to see you're recovering. Can you tell me what happened out there?" Rachel took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the pain in her ribs, and began recounting her ordeal. She described her photography expedition, getting lost in the dark, and the terrifying encounter with the grizzly bear. Ranger Holden listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. "You did everything right," he said when she finished. "Playing dead was the best course of action in that situation. Your quick thinking likely saved your life." Rachel managed a weak smile. "Doesn't feel like I did everything right. I shouldn't have let myself get so far off trail or lose track of time like that." Ranger Holden nodded sympathetically. "Hindsight is 20/20, Ms. Bennett. The important thing is you survived. Now we'll need to file an official report about this incident. It's standard procedure for any wildlife attack in the park." Will anything happen to the bear?" Rachel asked hesitantly. The ranger shook his head. "Based on your account, this seems to have been a chance encounter, not a predatory attack. The bear was likely just as surprised as you were. We'll increase patrols in that area and post warnings for hikers, but unless the bear shows further aggressive behavior towards humans, no action will be taken against it." Rachel felt a wave of relief wash over her. Despite everything, she didn't want the bear to be harmed. It was, after all, just being a bear in its natural habitat. "One more thing," Ranger Holden said, reaching into his bag. "We recovered your camera equipment. It's all intact." He placed her camera bag on the bedside table. "I thought you might want to have it with you." Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes at the sight of her beloved camera. "Thank you," she whispered. After the ranger left, Rachel was left alone with her thoughts. The gravity of what she had experienced began to sink in. She had come face to face with one of nature's most powerful predators and lived to tell the tale. The encounter had been terrifying, painful, and yet there was something almost profound about it. A knock at the door interrupted her musings. A young woman poked her head in. "Ms. Bennett, I'm Sarah from the Glacier Country Gazette. We heard about your encounter with the grizzly. Would you be willing to share your story with our readers?" Rachel hesitated. She was exhausted, and the idea of rehashing the ordeal so soon was daunting. But then she thought about the photos still in her camera, the story they could tell alongside her account of the attack. "All right," she said finally, "but on one condition. This isn't just about the attack. It's about the beauty and power of nature, even in its most dangerous forms. And it's about respecting the wilderness, understanding that we're visitors in these animals' homes." Sarah nodded eagerly, pulling out a notebook. "Of course, Ms. Bennett. Why don't you start at the beginning? Tell me what drew you to wildlife, photography in the first place." As Rachel began to speak, she felt a spark of her old passion reigniting. Yes, she had been through a traumatic experience, but it hadn't diminished her love for the wild. If anything, it had deepened her respect for the raw, untamed beauty of nature. The attack would leave its mark on her, both physically and emotionally. But as she shared her story, Rachel realized that it would also become a part of her larger narrative as a wildlife photographer. It was a reminder of the risks and rewards of her chosen path, a testament to the unpredictable and awesome power of the natural world. And somewhere out there in the vast wilderness of Glacier National Park, a grizzly bear roamed free, unaware of the profound impact it had made on one human's life. In the end, that was exactly as it should be. The days following Rachel's encounter with the grizzly bear blurred together in a haze of pain medication, medical procedures, and fitful sleep. Her hospital room became a revolving door of doctors, nurses, and well-wishers, each visit a reminder of how close she had come to death in the wilderness she loved. On the 4th day of her hospital stay, Rachel woke to find her room bathed in warm sunlight. She blinked, adjusting to the brightness, and noticed a familiar figure sitting in the chair by her bed. "Mom," Rachel croaked, her voice still rough from sleep. Linda Bennett looked up from the magazine she'd been flipping through, a relieved smile spreading across her face. "Oh, sweetheart, you're awake. How are you feeling?" Rachel attempted to sit up, wincing as her broken ribs protested the movement. Her mother quickly moved to help her, adjusting the pillows to make her more comfortable. "Like I've been through a meat grinder," Rachel admitted with a weak chuckle. "But I'm alive, so I can't complain too much." Linda's eyes welled with tears as she took her daughter's hand. "When I got that call, Rachel, I was so scared. I thought I'd lost you." "I'm sorry, Mom," Rachel said softly. "I never meant to put you through that." Her mother shook her head, wiping away a stray tear. "Don't apologize. I know how much your work means to you. I wish it wasn't so dangerous." Rachel sighed, looking out the window at the mountains visible in the distance. "It's not usually this dangerous. I got careless, made some mistakes. But Mom, even after all this, I can't imagine doing anything else." Linda nodded, a mix of pride and worry in her eyes. "I know, sweetheart, you've always been drawn to the wild. Even as a little girl, you were happiest when you were exploring the woods behind our house." The mention of her childhood brought a smile to Rachel's face. "Remember when I tried to bring that baby raccoon home? I was convinced I could tame it." Her mother laughed. "How could I forget? You were covered in scratches, but you were so proud of yourself for catching it." Their reminiscing was interrupted by a knock at the door. Dr. Erickson entered, clipboard in hand and a serious expression on his face. "Good morning, Ms. Bennett. How are you feeling today?" Rachel straightened up as best she could. "Better, I think. The pain's still there, but it's more manageable." The doctor nodded, making a note on his clipboard. "That's good to hear. Your latest test results have come back, and I wanted to discuss them with you." Linda squeezed her daughter's hand. "Do you want me to step out?" Rachel shook her head. "No, please stay." Dr. Erickson pulled up a chair. "All right, Ms. Bennett, the good news is that there's no sign of infection in your wounds. The antibiotics seem to be doing their job. However, we are concerned about the extent of muscle damage in your left leg." Rachel felt her heart sink. What does that mean exactly? "The bear's claws did significant damage to the muscle tissue," the doctor explained. "While we expect you to regain function, it's going to take time and a lot of work. You're looking at several months of intensive physical therapy." The news hit Rachel like a punch to the gut. Several months of recovery meant several months away from her work, away from the wilderness she loved. Will I be able to hike again? To carry my camera equipment?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Erickson's expression softened. "With dedication to your recovery, yes. But it's going to be a long road, Ms. Bennett. You'll need to be patient with yourself." Rachel nodded, trying to process the information. Her mother squeezed her hand again, offering silent support. "There's one more thing," the doctor continued. "Given the traumatic nature of your experience, we'd like you to speak with a psychiatrist. It's common for survivors of animal attacks to experience PTSD or other psychological effects." "I don't need a shrink," Rachel protested. "I'm fine," Linda interjected gently. "Rachel, honey, it couldn't hurt to talk to someone. You've been through a terrible ordeal." Rachel wanted to argue further, but the concerned looks from both her mother and Dr. Erickson made her reconsider. Fine, she conceded. I'll talk to someone. After the doctor left, Rachel fell into a contemplative silence. The full weight of her situation was starting to sink in. Months of recovery, physical therapy, psychological counseling. It was overwhelming. What am I going to do, Mom? She finally asked, her voice small and vulnerable in a way it hadn't been. Since she was a child, Linda moved to sit on the edge of the bed, careful not to jostle her daughter's injuries. You're going to heal, sweetheart. You're going to work hard and get better. And when you're ready, you'll go back out there and take more of your beautiful pictures. Rachel felt tears welling up in her eyes. But what if I can't? What if I'm too scared? Or what if I'm never strong enough to hike and carry my gear again? Her mother cupped her face gently. Rachel Bennett, you are the strongest, most determined person I know. You survived a bear attack. You dragged yourself for miles with broken ribs and deep wounds. If you can do that, you can do anything. The tears spilled over then, and Rachel let out a sob that was equal parts pain, fear, and relief. Her mother held her as best she could, mindful of her injuries, as Rachel cried out all the emotions she'd been holding back. When the tears finally subsided, Rachel felt drained but somehow lighter. She wiped her eyes and managed a weak smile. Thanks, Mom, I needed that. Linda kissed her forehead. That's what mothers are for, sweetheart. Now why don't you get some rest? I'll be right here if you need anything. As Rachel settled back against her pillows, her eyes fell on her camera bag, still sitting on the bedside table where Ranger Holden had left it. Despite everything, she felt a familiar stirring of excitement at the thought of the images contained within. She had captured something rare and powerful out there in the wilderness. Yes, she had paid a high price for those photos, but as she drifted off to sleep, Rachel found herself looking forward to the day when she could share them with the world. The road to recovery would be long and challenging, but Rachel Bennett was a survivor. She had faced nature at its most ferocious and lived to tell the tale. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage and determination that had kept her alive in the forest. As sleep claimed her, Rachel's last conscious thought was of the bear. In her mind's eye, she saw it not as a terrifying monster, but as a magnificent creature in its natural habitat. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and pain, she felt the first flicker of a desire to return to the wild, to once again capture the raw beauty of nature through her lens. The following weeks were a blur of pain, frustration, and small victories for Rachel Bennett. Her days were filled with a grueling routine of physical therapy sessions, wound care, and psychological counseling. Each day brought new challenges, but also small steps towards recovery. On a particularly tough morning, about 3 weeks after the attack, Rachel found herself in the hospital's physical therapy room, gritting her teeth as she attempted to put weight on her injured leg. Come on, Rachel, her physical therapist Jake encouraged. Just a few more steps, you're doing great. Rachel's face was contorted with effort and pain as she shuffled forward, her hands gripping the parallel bars tightly. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her breath came in short, sharp gasps. I can't, she panted, stopping mid-step. It hurts too much. Jake moved closer, his voice firm but kind. Yes, you can. I know it hurts, but you're stronger than the pain. Just one more step. Drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she had, Rachel forced herself to take that final step. As she reached the end of the bars, a mix of exhaustion and triumph washed over her. There you go, Jake exclaimed, helping her into a nearby wheelchair. That's the furthest you've walked yet. You should be proud of yourself, Rachel managed, a weak smile as she caught her breath. Doesn't feel like much to be proud of. A few steps and I'm exhausted. Hey, none of that, Jake admonished gently. 3 weeks ago you could barely move your leg, now you're walking. That's progress, Rachel. Real, tangible progress. As Jake helped her back to her room, Rachel's mind wandered to the images she had captured before the attack. She hadn't looked at them yet, partly out of fear of the memories they might trigger, and partly because she wasn't sure she was ready to face that part of her life again. Once settled back in her bed, Rachel's gaze fell on her camera bag, still sitting untouched on the bedside table. Taking a deep breath, she reached for it, wincing slightly at the pull on her healing wounds. Here goes nothing, she muttered to herself, as she powered on the camera. The first few images were exactly what she had hoped to capture. Majestic, held in the golden light of dawn, their breath visible in the crisp mountain air. Despite everything, Rachel felt a surge of pride. These were good shots, possibly some of her best work. Then she came to the last images, taken just before the bear attack. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw the massive grizzly, partially obscured by foliage, its eyes seeming to stare directly into the camera lens. "Oh my God," Rachel whispered, her heart racing. The image was terrifying and beautiful all at once. She had captured the raw power and majesty of the creature in a way few photographers ever managed. A knock at the door startled her out of her reverie. She looked up to see Sarah, the reporter from the Glacier Country Gazette, standing in the doorway. "Miss Bennett, I hope I'm not interrupting. I was wondering if you had a chance to think about that interview we discussed." Rachel hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Actually, your timing is perfect. I was just looking at the photos I took that day." Sarah's eyes widened with interest. "Really? Would you be willing to share them as part of the story?" Rachel considered the question. These photos were intensely personal, a visual record of her near-death experience. But they were also a testament to the beauty and power of nature, even in its most dangerous forms. "Yes," she decided. "I think I would. But I have some conditions." Sarah nodded eagerly, pulling out a notebook. "Of course. What did you have in mind?" "First," Rachel began, "this isn't just a story about a bear attack. It's about respecting nature, understanding the risks of wilderness exploration, and the importance of proper preparation. I made mistakes out there, and I want others to learn from them." "Absolutely," Sarah agreed. "That's an important message to convey." "Second," Rachel continued, "I want to make it clear that the bear was just being a bear. It wasn't a monster or a villain. It was a wild animal defending its territory. Any negative consequences of this incident should fall on me, not the bear." Sarah jotted down notes, nodding her understanding. "That's a very mature perspective, Ms. Bennett. I think our readers will appreciate that." Rachel took a deep breath before stating her final condition. "Lastly, I want a portion of any proceeds from this story to go towards conservation efforts in Glacier National Park. If my experience can help protect the wilderness and the creatures that call it home, then maybe some good can come out of all this." Sarah's face lit up with a genuine smile. "That's a wonderful idea, Ms. Bennett. I think we can definitely arrange that." As they began the interview, Rachel found herself opening up about her experience in a way she hadn't before, not even with her therapist. She described the beauty of the park, the thrill of tracking the elk herd, and the heart-stopping moment when she first saw the bear. When she got to the attack itself, Rachel's voice faltered. I thought I was going to die," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But even then, even as I was terrified beyond belief, there was a part of me that couldn't help but marvel at the bear's power and beauty." Sarah listened intently, her pen flying across the pages of her notebook. "That's incredible, Ms. Bennett. Your passion for wildlife really comes through, even when describing such a traumatic event." As the interview wound down, Rachel found herself feeling lighter, as if sharing her story had lifted a weight from her shoulders. She scrolled through the photos on her camera once more, lingering on the image of the bear. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I think this experience has changed me as a photographer. I've always tried to capture the essence of wildlife, but now I feel like I understand it in a way I never did before. The beauty, the danger, the raw, untamed spirit of it all." Sarah nodded, a look of admiration in her eyes. "That comes through in your words, Ms. Bennett. I have no doubt it will come through in your future work as well." As Sarah packed up her things and prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Thank you for sharing your story, Ms. Bennett. I think it's going to touch a lot of people." After the reporter left, Rachel leaned back in her bed, feeling drained but oddly invigorated. She picked up her camera once more, looking at the bear photo. For the first time since the attack, she didn't feel fear when she saw the image. Instead, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, she had a long road of recovery ahead. Yes, there would be challenges and setbacks. But Rachel Bennett was a survivor, and she was determined to turn this harrowing experience into something positive. She would heal, she would return to the wilderness, and she would continue to share the beauty and power of nature through her lens. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Rachel's dreams were not of terror and pain, but of majestic landscapes and powerful creatures. And somewhere in those dreams, a grizzly bear roamed free, a symbol not of fear, but of the wild, untamed spirit of nature that had captured her heart so many years ago. 2 months after the bear attack, Rachel Bennett found herself back in Missoula, Montana. The familiar sights and sounds of her hometown were a comfort after the long weeks in the hospital, but she couldn't shake the feeling of restlessness that had been growing inside her. On a crisp autumn morning, Rachel sat on her small apartment balcony, sipping coffee and staring at the distant mountains. Her leg, still healing, was propped up on a chair, a constant reminder of her ordeal. The physical scars were healing well, but the emotional ones were proving more stubborn. A knock at the door broke her reverie. "It's open, Mom," she called out, recognizing the familiar pattern of knocks. Linda Bennett entered, carrying a paper bag that smelled enticingly of fresh pastries. "Good morning, sweetheart. I brought breakfast from that bakery you love." Rachel smiled gratefully. "Thanks, Mom. You didn't have to do that." "Nonsense," Linda replied, setting the bag on the small table and taking a seat across from her daughter. "How are you feeling today?" Rachel shrugged, wincing slightly at the pull on her still tender muscles. "Physically better. The pain's not as bad. Mentally, I don't know, restless, I guess." Linda studied her daughter's face, concern evident in her eyes. "Have you been sleeping any better?" "Not really," Rachel admitted. "The nightmares are less frequent, but they're still there. Last night I dreamt I was back in that forest, but this time I couldn't move at all. I just had to lie there and wait for the bear to find me." Her mother reached out, squeezing her hand gently. "Oh, honey, have you talked to Dr. Martinez about this?" Rachel nodded. "Yeah, we've been working on some techniques to manage the anxiety and PTSD symptoms. It helps, but—" She trailed off, her gaze drifting back to the mountains. "But what?" Linda prompted gently. Rachel sighed, turning back to face her mother. "But I feel stuck, Mom. I'm healing, but I'm not moving forward. My camera's just sitting there gathering dust. I haven't taken a single photo since it happened." Linda's expression softened with understanding. "Rachel, you went through a traumatic experience. It's okay to take time to heal, both physically and emotionally." "I know, but—" Rachel paused, struggling to find the right words. "Photography isn't just my job, Mom, it's who I am. And right now I feel like I've lost a part of myself." Just then Rachel's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and her eyebrows rose in surprise. "It's Sarah from the Glacier Country Gazette," she explained to her mother before answering the call. "Hello, Sarah," Rachel greeted, trying to inject some enthusiasm into her voice. "Rachel, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time," Sarah's voice came through, sounding excited. "No, not at all. What's up?" "Well, I have some news," Sarah replied. "Remember that article about your experience? It's been picked up by National Geographic. They want to run it in their next issue along with your photos." Rachel felt a jolt of surprise and a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a while. Her excitement. "National Geographic, are you serious?" "Absolutely, they were particularly impressed with your perspective on wildlife conservation and responsible wilderness exploration." "Oh, and there's more. They're interested in commissioning a series of articles from you about wildlife photography and safety in bear country." Rachel's mind reeled with the possibilities. This was an incredible opportunity, a chance to reach a wider audience with her message about respecting and protecting nature. But along with the excitement came a wave of anxiety. Could she do it? Was she ready to face the wilderness again? "Rachel, are you still there?" Sarah's voice broke through her thoughts. "Yes, sorry," Rachel replied quickly. "I'm just processing. This is incredible, Sarah. Thank you for letting me know." After ending the call, Rachel turned to her mother, who had been watching the one-sided conversation with curiosity. "Well?" Linda prompted. Rachel took a deep breath and explained the situation. As she spoke, she could see the mix of pride and concern in her mother's eyes. "Oh, sweetheart, that's wonderful news," Linda said when Rachel finished. "But are you ready for this?" "It's okay if you're not." Rachel pondered the question, her gaze once again drawn to the mountains in the distance. Was she ready? The thought of returning to the wilderness filled her with a potent mix of longing and fear. But as she considered it, she realized something. The fear wasn't of the bears or the wilderness itself. It was the fear of letting her traumatic experience define her, of losing the passion that had driven her for so long. "I think," Rachel began slowly, "I think I need to do this, Mom. I can't let what happened stop me from doing what I love. I don't know if I can do it alone." Linda reached out, taking both of Rachel's hands in hers. "Then don't do it alone. I may not be much help with the photography, but I can be there with you. We'll face this together." Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes at her mother's unwavering support. "Thanks, Mom. I don't know what I'd do without you." As they sat there, hands clasped, Rachel felt a shift inside her. The fear and anxiety were still there, but alongside them was a growing sense of determination. This was her chance to turn her harrowing experience into something positive, to use her story to educate and inspire others. Rachel stood up slowly, mindful of her healing leg, and made her way inside. She returned a moment later with her camera in hand. It felt both familiar and strange as she turned it over in her hands. "What do you say we go for a little walk?" Rachel suggested, a small smile playing on her lips. "Nothing too strenuous, just to the park down the street. I think it's time I started taking pictures again." Linda beamed at her daughter, pride shining in her eyes. "I think that's a wonderful idea, sweetheart." As they left the apartment, Rachel felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The road ahead would not be easy, but she was ready to take the first step. With her camera in hand and her mother by her side, Rachel Bennett was ready to reclaim her passion and share her story with the world. The wilderness, with all its beauty and danger, was calling to her once again. And this time, she would answer. That call with a newfound respect, wisdom and determination. The bear attack had changed her, but it hadn't defeated her. If anything, it had given her a new purpose, a new story to tell. And Rachel was finally ready to start telling it. 6 months after the bear attack, Rachel Bennett stood at the trailhead of a familiar path in Glacier National Park. The crisp autumn air filled her lungs as she took a deep breath, her hand instinctively tightening on the strap of her camera bag. This was the moment she had been both anticipating and dreading, her return to the place where her life had changed so dramatically. "Are you sure you're ready for this, honey?" Linda asked, concern evident in her voice as she stood beside her daughter. Rachel nodded, her eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "As ready as I'll ever be, Mom. I need to do this." The past few months had been a whirlwind of physical therapy, counseling sessions, and gradually easing back into her photography work. The National Geographic series had been a success, allowing Rachel to share her story and insights on wildlife safety with a broad audience. But this, returning to the actual site of the attack, was the final hurdle she needed to overcome. "All right. Ms. Bennett, are we all set?" The voice belonged to Park Ranger Mike Holden, who had volunteered to accompany Rachel and her mother on this trek. Rachel turned to the ranger, forcing a smile. "Yes, I think so. Thank you again for doing this, Ranger." "Holden, please call me Mike," he replied with a warm smile. "And it's my pleasure. Your story has done a lot to raise awareness about bear safety. It's the least I can do to support your journey." As they set off down the trail, Rachel felt a mix of emotions washing over her. The familiar sights and sounds of the forest brought back a flood of memories, both the beauty she had captured with her camera and the terror of the attack. She found herself constantly scanning her surroundings, her body tense and alert. Linda noticed her daughter's unease and gently touched her arm. "You're doing great, sweetheart. Remember what Dr. Martinez said. Acknowledge the fear, but don't let it control you." Rachel nodded, taking another deep breath. "Right, I'm okay. It's just strange being back here." As they hiked, Mike pointed out various plants and animal signs, his knowledge of the park evident in every observation. Rachel found herself relaxing, slightly, falling into the familiar rhythm of nature photography as she paused occasionally to capture interesting scenes. About an hour into their hike, they reached a small clearing. Rachel stopped abruptly, her breath catching in her throat. "This is it," she whispered. "This is where I first saw the bear." The clearing looked different in the autumn light. the summer's lush green replaced by the warm hues of fall. Yet Rachel could still vividly recall the moment when she had first locked eyes with the grizzly. Mike stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Remember, Rachel, you're safe here. We've taken every precaution, and bear activity in this area has been minimal lately." Rachel nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the spot where the bear had emerged. Slowly, almost mechanically, she raised her camera and began to take photos of the clearing. "What are you thinking, honey?" Linda asked, watching her daughter with a mix of concern and pride. Rachel lowered her camera, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I'm thinking, it's beautiful here. Even knowing what happened, I can't help but see the beauty of this place." She turned to face her mother and Mike. "I spent so long focusing on the terror of that moment, I almost forgot why I came here in the first place. This," she gestured to the forest around them, "this is why I do what I do. To capture this beauty, to share it with others." Mike smiled, nodding in understanding. "That's a powerful realization, Rachel. The wilderness isn't inherently dangerous or safe. It simply is. Our job is to appreciate its beauty while respecting its power." As they continued their hike, Rachel found herself becoming more relaxed. She began to engage more with her surroundings, her photographer's eye seeking out compelling images. The fear was still there, a low hum in the background, but it no longer dominated her thoughts. They reached the fallen tree where Rachel had sought shelter during the attack. She stood before it, her expression unreadable. "Do you want to talk about it?" Linda asked softly. Rachel was quiet for a moment before responding. "You know, lying here thinking I was going to die, I made a promise to myself. I promised that if I survived, I'd use my photography to help people understand and respect nature, even its dangerous aspects." She turned to face her mother and Mike, a new determination in her eyes. "I think it's time I fully embraced that promise." Mike nodded approvingly. "That's a noble goal, Rachel, and based on the impact your National Geographic series has had, I'd say you're already well on your way." As they made their way back to the trailhead, Rachel felt a sense of peace settling over her. The forest that had been the site of her greatest terror was once again becoming a place of beauty and inspiration. Near the end of the trail, a movement in the bushes caught Rachel's attention. Her body tensed instinctively, but as she raised her camera, she saw it was a young black bear foraging peacefully some distance away. Without hesitation, Rachel began to photograph the bear, her movements calm and assured. Linda and Mike watched in amazement as she worked, her fear seemingly forgotten in the face of this perfect photographic moment. When the bear ambled away, Rachel lowered her camera, a genuine smile on her face. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement. "He was beautiful." Linda hugged her daughter, tears in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you, Rachel. You've come so far." Mike clapped Rachel on the shoulder. "That was impressive, Rachel. You handled that situation perfectly, maintained a safe distance, stayed calm, and got some great shots, I'm sure." As they reached the parking lot, Rachel felt a sense of accomplishment washing over her. She had faced her fears, returned to the scene of her darkest moment, and emerged stronger. The bear attack would always be a part of her story, but it no longer defined her. "So," Linda said, as they prepared to leave, "what's next for you, sweetheart?" Rachel looked out at the mountains, a spark of adventure in her eyes. I think it's time to start planning my next photography expedition. There's so much more of the wilderness to explore, so many more stories to tell." She turned to her mother, grinning. "But maybe this time I'll invest in a satellite phone and take a few more safety precautions." As they drove away from Glacier National Park, Rachel felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her journey of recovery had been long and challenging, but it had led her to a deeper understanding of herself and her passion. The wilderness, in all its beauty and danger, was still her home, and she was ready to share its stories with the world, one photograph at a time. 1 year after the grizzly bear attack, Rachel Bennett stood before a captivated audience in a packed auditorium at the University of Montana. The large screen behind her displayed a stunning image of a grizzly bear, powerful and majestic, standing in a field of wildflowers. "This," Rachel began, her voice steady and confident, "is the bear that nearly killed me." A hushed murmur rippled, through the crowd. Rachel smiled, her eyes scanning the sea of faces before her. She saw a mix of emotions, awe, fear, curiosity, but most of all, she saw engagement. These people were here to listen, to learn, and to understand. But this is also the bear that taught me the most valuable lesson of my career, she continued. It taught me about respect. Respect for nature, respect for wildlife, and respect for the delicate balance we must maintain as visitors in their world. Over the next hour, Rachel took her audience on a journey. She shared her story, not just of the attack, but of her recovery, her struggles, and her ultimate return to wildlife photography. She showed them images from before the attack, and then her more recent work, pointing out how her perspective had shifted. Before the attack, I was focused solely on getting the perfect shot, she explained, clicking through a series of beautiful but somewhat detached wildlife photos. I was an observer, separate from the world I was photographing. She then switched to her post-attack work. These images were different, more intimate, more respectful. They showed animals in their natural habitats, undisturbed by the photographer's presence. Now I see myself as part of the ecosystem, Rachel said. I'm not just an observer, but a participant in the delicate dance of nature. My goal isn't just to capture beautiful images, but to tell stories that foster understanding and promote conservation. As she concluded her presentation, Rachel opened the floor for questions. Hands shot up across the auditorium. A young woman in the front row was the first to speak. Ms. Bennett, aren't you afraid to go back into bear country after what happened? Rachel nodded, acknowledging the valid question. Fear is a natural response, and yes, there are times when I feel afraid, but I've learned to use that fear productively. It keeps me alert, makes me more aware of my surroundings. Fear, when respected and managed, can be a powerful tool for staying safe in the wilderness. An older man towards the back stood up next. Your work is beautiful, but isn't it dangerous to encourage people to seek out close encounters with wildlife? That's an excellent point, Rachel replied, and it's precisely why education is so crucial. My goal isn't to encourage close encounters, but to teach people how to appreciate wildlife from a safe and respectful distance. The zoom lens is a wildlife photographer's best friend, she added with a smile, eliciting a chuckle from the audience. The questions continued, touching on topics ranging from photography techniques to wildlife conservation efforts. Rachel answered, each one thoughtfully, drawing on her experiences and the knowledge she'd gained over the past year. As the session wound down, a final question came from a young boy, perhaps no more than 10 years old. Miss Bennett, do you hate the bear that attacked you? The auditorium fell silent, all eyes on Rachel. She took a moment before answering, her gaze drifting to the image of the grizzly still displayed on the screen. No, she said softly. Then with more conviction, no, I don't hate the bear. The bear was just being a bear. It was acting on instinct, protecting its territory. If anything, I'm grateful. Seeing the confused looks on many faces, Rachel elaborated. I'm grateful because that experience, traumatic as it was, gave me a new perspective. It made me a better photographer, a better conservationist, and I'd like to think, a better person. It taught me to truly respect the wild, not just admire it from afar. As the applause died down and people began to file out of the auditorium, Rachel noticed a familiar face approaching the stage. It was Sarah, the reporter from the Glacier Country Gazette who had first shared her story. Rachel, that was incredible, Sarah exclaimed, reaching out to shake her hand. You've come so far since we first talked in that hospital room. Rachel smiled warmly. Sarah, I'm so glad you could make it. And thank you for everything. If you hadn't encouraged me to share my story, I'm not sure I'd be standing here today. Sarah waved off the thanks. You did all the hard work, I just helped get the word out. She paused, then added with a grin, So, any plans for your next adventure? I hear Yellowstone is beautiful this time of year. Rachel laughed. Actually, I am planning a trip to Yellowstone, but this time I'm leading a wildlife photography workshop. We'll be teaching people how to capture amazing images while prioritizing safety and conservation. That sounds wonderful, Sarah replied. Mind if I tag along? I think there might be a follow-up story in there somewhere. As they chatted, Rachel found her gaze drawn to the window. Outside, the mountains of Montana stretched toward the sky, wild and beautiful. The sight filled her with a familiar longing, but now it was tempered with a deep respect and understanding. Later that evening, as Rachel packed up her gear, she took a moment to look at her reflection in the auditorium's large windows. The scars from the bear attack were still visible, a permanent reminder of her encounter with nature's raw power. But they no longer filled her with fear or regret. Instead, she saw them as marks of resilience, of survival, of a profound connection with the wild world she loved. They were part of her story now, a story she would continue to tell through her photographs and her words. As she stepped out into the cool Montana night, Rachel felt a sense of peace wash over her. The wilderness, with all its beauty and danger, was calling to her once again. But this time she would answer that call with a newfound wisdom and respect. She pulled out her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Hey, Mom," she said when Linda answered. "I was thinking, how would you like to join me on my Yellowstone workshop? I could use an assistant, and well, I'd love to share this with you." Linda's voice was warm with pride and love. "Oh, sweetheart, I'd be honored. Are you sure you want your old mom tagging along?" Rachel laughed. "Mom, after everything we've been through this past year, there's no one I'd rather have by my side." As she ended the call and looked up at the star-filled sky, Rachel Bennett felt a surge of excitement for the future. She had faced her fears, reclaimed her passion, and found a new purpose. The bear that had nearly taken her life had, in the end, given her a new one, richer, deeper, and more connected to the wild world she loved. With a smile on her face and her camera bag slung over her shoulder, Rachel headed home, ready for whatever adventures tomorrow might bring.